22nd. Is that what it is?
Yeah, although the thing with the reopening in New York is they're kind of keep moving the milepost away depending on what's going on. You know, first it was May 15th and then they extended it to June 15th. And then the other thing is that they're phasing in businesses. They're like 4 phases, you know, from like essential to least essential. Martial arts schools are phase 4. You know, martial arts schools and gym were considered the least important thing for the city or whatever, right? So we have to kind of play it by ear, and you know, we'll see how that goes.
Okay, yeah, because I was checking on your website. So I got to tell you this, right?
Yes.
You know, there's a saying, "Never meet your heroes." that is so wrong. That is so wrong, right? Because you are an example of why it is good to meet your heroes.
Oh, thank you.
You're one of my heroes. You got a successful school. You got a successful podcast, right? You know, there's just so much stuff that that you're doing that I think is right on.
Oh, thank you.
And you're friends with that guy.
Which guy?
Your co-host.
Oh, that guy. Yeah. Friends is a very loose term when it comes to the relationship Sean and I have. But yeah, we can tolerate each other for 45 minutes at a time.
Yeah. All right. So I wanted to spring this 15 minutes early surprise on people, right? But a lot of them are wise to it. So yeah. So well, let me do the official intro. Let me pull up my notes here. Okay, just give me 1 second. Let me read this off. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Dwight Woods, the Jeet Kune Do Rebel, and welcome to today's episode number 128 of the Jeet Kune Do Dialogues. As you guys are logging in, if you'd be kind enough to say where you're logging in from. Yes, I know we're like 10, 15 minutes early, right? But say where you're logging in from, hit the like button, and feel free to continue doing so throughout the dialogue. Also, if you're catching the final edit video over on the YouTube, when you're there, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And if you enjoy my work and you'd like to support the program, consider visiting jkdrebel.com. Click on the Rebel Gear link and check it out. But of course, the best thing you can do is to share the video and spread the word about the Jeet Kune Do Dialogues. Okay, so my dialogue partner today is a guy, I guess we could say I know him only on the periphery, right? Because I've dialogued with his Dudes of Kung Fu co-host, Sean Madigan. I've watched many of your, I think it's EHOW videos. And one of your female students a few years ago trapped the hell out of me at a marketing conference.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
Wow.
All right. So with that, Alex Richter, welcome to the Jeet Kune Do Dialogues.
Wow. Thank you so much for having me. This is a great honor. I've been listening to your podcast now. I pop in when it's up, and I think it's great. I love what you do. So thank you so much for having me.
So hey, let me ask you this. Would it be incorrect for me to call you Sifu Alex Richter?
You can call me Alex. You can call me whatever you want. It's fine. So, I mean, definitely I teach things in a very traditional way, but I'm not one of these guys who insists. You ever see that Maestro episode of Seinfeld? Like, you have to call me Maestro, right? So I'm definitely not that guy. I mean, like, if you want to just call me Alex during the podcast, whatever, that's totally fine. I'm totally cool with that.
No, but see, that's what I wanted people to become aware of, that, because what I love about what you and Sean do is that you have the most relaxed approach to Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do that I've ever seen. But I know that in the back of it is this really, really serious approach to all things Kung Fu.
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
But up front, right? Up front, you guys said, so I wanted, because I couldn't find it. I wanted to listen to it in preparation for talking to you. But tell people about the whole Kung Fu family tree system.
Sure.
Right.
This is a great topic, because I think there's some people who think that the terms like Sifu denote some kind of almost militaristic hierarchy. And actually, the term family is correct, you know, because it's supposed to be like a family, not like a cult, but like a family. Okay, so that's where people tend to kind of go. And the Manson also had a family too, right? So we mean it in the least creepy sense possible. So the Sifu is essentially, you know, it technically means like your Kung Fu father. I prefer the term mentor because it's weird for me to tell my students, I'm your Kung Fu father, right? It's like, yeah, I find it a little bit odd. But, you know, the Sifu is kind of the centerpiece. And then you are the direct student of your Sifu, and all the different terms that you use are based on your relationship with that particular person. So an elder Kung Fu brother of yours is your Si-Heng. And your Si-Heng might be a Sifu with their own students, but they're your Si-Heng, so you don't call them Sifu so-and-so, you call them Si-Heng, right?
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Absolutely.
Please do not use the American pronunciations.
I use the American pronunciations so that people know what I'm saying.
No, to heck with them.
Okay.
You right? Because here's the thing. I forgot to tell you this about why you're one of my heroes. You can watch any Cantonese Kung Fu film and you don't need English subtitles.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go that far to say my Cantonese is that flawless. The only reason I know them is because I've watched them 100 times, right? Maybe that's the reason why I don't need subtitles, right? Yeah, I mean, I can speak basic Cantonese. My vocabulary when it comes to Chinese martial arts is much higher than my vocabulary, let's say, about finance or politics. So I have a bit of a disparity in the things I can talk about in Cantonese, right? But yeah, I mean, I thought that learning Chinese martial arts, if you really want to understand it, you have to understand the culture as well, right? And so I went through great pains. Oddly enough, the real reason why I wanted to learn Cantonese and wanted to learn how to read Chinese characters was because of Bruce Lee. Because I remember looking at his notes in Dao Jeet Kune Do or any of like the various books that publish his notes. And you would see what he wrote in English, and oftentimes these were notes on books that he was reading on boxing or fencing or whatever. But then you would look in the side and there'd be a bunch of stuff in Chinese. And I would look at that and I would go, what is he writing in Chinese that he's not writing in English? So I wanted to start learning how to read Chinese characters initially so I could decipher Bruce Lee's Chinese notes compared to what he was writing in English. And when I started to do that, I noticed something really interesting. Most of the notes he writes in English are notes on whatever he's reading about, whether it's a boxing book or something like that. The notes in the liner he's comparing it to Wing Chun. He's saying like, this is like this thing in Wing Chun. This is like this. In Wing Chun, we would do this to fight this. And so it was really interesting because Chinese was shorthand for him. So he wrote in English because he's just copying what he's seeing in the book. The Chinese was the shorthand for his own actual notes. And that I found was really fascinating because it also gives you a glimpse in terms of what his understanding and ideas of Wing Chun were. And it was simply, that was the original reason why I started learning it. And then of course, after that, it bloomed into, I want to learn it for other things as well. But that was the original impetus for me to learn Chinese. Yeah,
and isn't there something about the movies you taught yourself from the movies?
Yeah, so it's actually funny because for some people who don't know me in Hong Kong, sometimes I'll meet some Chinese Kung Fu master of whatever style. And then invariably, I'm introduced by another one of my Chinese friends that says, hey, Alex can say some lines from some of Bruce Lee's films, right? And then so they're like, they're like, really? And then I might like spout a line from like, let's say, Fist of Fury or something like that. And they think it's really funny. And then, like for example, the very famous scene where Bruce Lee in Fist of Fury, where he comes and he beats the stuffing out of all the Japanese guys. And then he wants to tell them that the Chinese are not sick men. Now, when you hear it in English, it's like still very powerful because this is like the Chinese had really lost a lot of their identity because of what the Japanese had done during the invasion. And for a Chinese person to like stand proudly in front of the Japanese, that was a huge deal culturally, even in 1972. But the way Bruce Lee says it in Cantonese gives me goosebumps because it's different than in the English version. Because he says like they gauge you. 中國人唔係病夫. And he literally says, don't forget, the Chinese, we are not sick people. And then he walks, and then it's just like, but when you hear the way he's expressing it, like I see, even like now when I say it, I get goosebumps.
Yeah.
It's just like, and then I'll say this for my Chinese friends, and of course they laugh because I'm a white guy saying, we Chinese are not sick men, right? So the whole thing is just ridiculous, right? So that ends up being kind of like, kind of one of the things that endears me to some of these older Sifus and makes them want to tell me their stories, because they see that I'm clearly into the culture, right?
Yeah. You know what's interesting as you're talking about culture, because I have always been, as a kid growing up in a former British colony, Barbados, we got Hong Kong Kung Fu films, like 3 of them, 3 different movies every week, right? So I grew up with that too. But then the other aspect of culture that has always fascinated me as a kid from the islands is New York, right? So let me tell you this. I listen to you, and when I hear you say Chinese stuff, you remind me of another Alex from New York. My Jeet Kune Do colleague from New Breed Martial Arts, Alex Chan. Your Chinese sounds like his, and I'm wondering, right? But so I'm wondering, it must be a New York thing. Right?
Maybe I have a New York, my Cantonese is a New York accent, right? So it's what they call the New York style Chinglish, right? Yeah, it's quite possible, quite possible. Yeah. Definitely. That's funny. That's really funny.
Okay, so one of the things that we found out quite recently is that we also, so apart from New York and Chinese culture and British colony and what have you, that we have Seattle in common.
That's right.
So, but you were born in California?
I was born in California. Yeah, I always say, like, kind of with my eyes down, because I'm from the East Coast. I grew up in Jersey. All right, I talk like I'm from Jersey, right? So I grew up in Jersey, but I was born in California. So I was actually born in Los Angeles. My parents moved back to the East Coast when I was only 2 years old. So I don't really remember California. I grew up in Jersey, but I went to high school out in Seattle. So I've kind of gone from coast to coast. I identify with being an East Coaster. I've lived here more than anywhere else, but I did live on the West Coast for a time in my life. Yeah.
And so where was it that you got your martial arts start? Where did you do the Taekwondo? On the East Coast or on the West Coast? Yeah,
Taekwondo and karate, I started in New Jersey, in Lincroft, New Jersey. And, I actually started karate because my neighbor punched out my tooth and essentially bullied me. At that time, the Karate Kid just came out. So I'm like, I want to learn karate. There happened to be a karate school in my town. I started learning karate. The guy who punched my tooth out, I ended up going back and punching him, hitting him in the mouth. Then he joined the karate school and we became friends, right? And that's kind of like my story. But the thing is, I got into it because of the Karate Kid. But my father one time rented Enter the Dragon, which I was like 8 years old. It's not really the most appropriate film for an 8-year-old, but my father's German, so nudity wasn't a problem. So it was like, there's some nudity in this film. Who cares? It's martial arts. Enjoy it. Yeah. And when I saw Enter the Dragon, that was like, it was different because it wasn't that I necessarily wanted to do Chinese Kung Fu. I wanted to be Bruce Lee. It completely changed me. And for the rest of my life thus far, to quote Bruce Lee's lost interview, martial art has a very deep meaning. As far as I always say, Bruce Lee has a very deep meaning as far as my life is concerned, right? And so that really changed it, because I think also my very modern, pragmatic way of looking at Wing Chun, it comes from Bruce Lee. If I'm like, I do a traditional martial art, but I have a very modern approach. There's nothing revolutionary about that. That guy did it 40 years before I was even around. I mean, I just feel like I'm always standing on the shoulders of these giants. And if we're not, Bruce Lee changed everything for me. And from that moment on, I started, reading martial arts magazines, reading about Bruce Lee. I wanted to learn Wing Chun, but there was no Wing Chun in Jersey. And it wasn't until we moved to Seattle when I started high school that around age 15, I came into the non-classical Wing Chun style, which is, oddly enough, a Wing Chun that came from a stream directly from Bruce Lee. So it was kind of like, for me, it was perfect because it was not just Wing Chun, but it was also in some way a form of Bruce Lee's Wing Chun. So I like it just then turned me into an absolute fanatic from that moment on.
Yeah. Tell everybody about that lineage, that Wing Chun lineage.
So
in
the
Seattle.
style of Wing Chun that I did was essentially a branch that came through James DeMille and also Ed Hart. So it wasn't actually from Jesse Glover. It was from these two specific other students of Bruce Lee's Seattle era. And then a guy named Sifu John Bial, who was James DeMille's student. He basically took the lessons that from Ed Hart and James DeMille, and then he formalized it into a very professional and step-by-step curriculum, which was always the problem with some of these early periods.
Oh, all right. That's not on my end, folks. So hang on for a second, and we'll get Alex back in. You'll just have to sign on again. I hope you're having fun with this. And I think yeah, I got you.
My internet connection is very strong. I don't know what happened. Maybe there was a glitch in the matrix. Somebody was trying to keep it down. All right.
Yeah, no, I'm hardwired, so I'm fairly sure that it's not on. Although sometimes when the weather starts acting up here, you know, it gets all funky, and I think I hear thunder rumbling in the back there. Anyhow,
yeah.
Anyhow, so yes.
So basically the John Bial took what he learned from James DeMille at Hart, and he really taught in a very professional way. And then he called that style of Wing Chun Chunjo Wing Chun, which is basically a very very professional expression of what James DeMille and Ed Hart taught. And I learned that as a teenager, and then so that's kind of like what's sometimes known as like Bruce Lee between Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do era. And so I became super fascinated with it. So then like from that moment on, like I got so into it and was just, it really changed the direction of my life. You know, with Sifu Johan who was my Sifu at that time, he changed my life. I mean, I would not be doing even though now I do Longtime Wing Chun or I'm doing this, that, or whatever, but like Sifu Johan he's the OG. He's the one who completely.
He is. He's so cool.
Yes. Yes.
I watch you talking to him, you know, and then I realized all of a sudden he still has the ponytail.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
He still got the ponytail.
Qing Dynasty Q that he had for so long. I remember seeing him for the first time and just like, you know, I'm 5'7". I'm the same height as Bruce Lee. And just like seeing Sifu Johan, this block of a man. And at that time, he would shave the front part of his head. So he had like the full Qing Dynasty Q, and just looking at this guy and going like, would not mess with this guy. Like you see this guy walking down the street and you go, I'm going to go that way there. But couldn't be a sweeter, more knowledgeable, more generous person. And still, even though the style of Wing Chun I teach is very different from that style that I initially learned from him, the way I teach and the way I interact with my students is 100% based on, you know, that interaction.
That's his influence, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's pretty cool. So they were the only people Bruce Lee connected in Seattle that you had interactions with?
Yeah, oddly enough, I remember because my teenage brain was so curious. I got my license at 16, which meant I could drive around to go to different places. And I wanted to learn from Taki Kimura because I was like, hey, he's, you know, the Jeet Kune Do guy, he had a student of Bruce Lee, all that kind of stuff. And he had at the time was teaching in the basement of a ShopRite, you know, shopping center in Seattle or something. Like he had owned a grocery store or something like that. And you had to get on a waiting list to go there. I didn't know how to get on I wrote a letter to him, right? And I was like, you know, probably he got a bunch of stuff like that. And I never heard back. I was very disappointed, but like, it's like I tried, right? And then I exchanged some emails with Jesse Glover a few times. And one of my fondest memories, I never had a chance to meet Jesse Glover, but my Sifu in WT and Longtime Wing Chun, Keith Kanchbeck, learned from Jesse Glover in the 70s. So he also had, you know, spoke very highly of Jesse Glover. And I remember that at that time, to get Jesse Glover's books, you had to like send a check to his PO box, and then he would like print them and bind them in that spiral and send it to you, right? And it was almost like the book came directly from him. And so I ordered all of his books. Had a couple non-classical books, Bruce Lee Between Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do, and I just like I had a job, and all my money went to martial arts. I ordered all of Jesse Glover's books all at once, and I sent it to the PO box, and I overpaid by $1.26. And Jesse Glover sent me my books and sent me a check for $1.26 signed by Jesse Glover. And I remember when I saw that check, it was like Jesse Glover saying it was for $1.26. I never cashed it. So I have that check still to this day. And, you know, now that he's not around anymore, you know, it's obviously one of my fondest things I have in my collection. Yeah. And so, you know, just to think that I overpaid by like $1.25 and he wrote me a check.
That's funny.
So sweet.
That's funny.
That is unfortunately my limited interaction with the late Jesse Glover. But yeah. And I did meet James DeMille. I actually fought in a sport jiu-jitsu tournament at James DeMille's school and fought and defeated a jiu-jitsu guy in front of James DeMille, which was like one of the most amazing moments in my entire life.
Okay, when was that? What is up with that? Because they were having tournaments. James DeMille was having tournaments for their brand of Wing Chun.
No. So what happened was this was already in the late 90s. I want to say this was around 1997. And like the UFC was a couple years old, and like the big thing about doing grappling was kind of a big deal. Right. And then there was a sport jiu-jitsu tournament that it allowed you to do some striking. It had but it had a lot of, there were like no elbows, no knees, and there were like lots of rules, totally favored the grappler. And then it was like you went to the ground, and at the end, maybe you could only fight on the ground for 30 seconds, and then they stood you up. And so I think that he thought that it was a nice transitory way to kind of test the skills. And so it was almost like a franchise, this sport jiu-jitsu tournament, and they had it at different places. So we started hosting them at his school. And the very first one he had, Sifu Johan, I remember he was like, hey, do you want to fight in a sport jiu-jitsu tournament? And man, when I was that age, I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. I only knew like 2 ground escapes and an arm lock. I mean, my entire jiu-jitsu arsenal would take 3 lines on ruled sheet of paper. That was like what I knew. And I was like, fine, whatever. And I remember I didn't really think much about it until the day before. And then the day before, I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna fight like in a jiu-jitsu tournament. And I got really nervous. And honest to God story, I didn't know what to do with all this like nervous energy. And I took the Tao of Jeet Kune Do from my bookshelf. And I remember in the end of it, he has some lines about like mental preparation, you know, like about your attitude in fighting. And I was a teenager. And normally you can't tell teenagers anything. They're not going to believe it. They're not going to listen. I remember reading this and seeing about how fear is about, it's a surplus, and about how you have to put your mind to be focused and not worry about defeat and to embrace it and all this kind of stuff. And I remember reading it and then suddenly feeling calm. Yeah. And the next day I went to the jiu-jitsu tournament. They did not have enough people to justify all the weight classes. So I had to fight someone way heavier than me who was a brown belt for my first fight. And I remember just looking at him, and then I looked and there's like Sifu Johan sitting, there's James DeMille, and that guy's a jiu-jitsu guy and I'm a Wing Chun guy. And I just remember saying, I can't lose to this guy. Whatever happens, I cannot lose to this guy. And then so I went in and I just started chain punching him. The ref comes in and says, no, you can't do chain punching because they cannot count those as points because they're called flurry punches. And I was like, immediately right at the beginning, I was like, he just took away my main weapon. And then so I was like, okay, remember, you're also a Taekwondo black belt. So I just like kicking the guy from far away, kicking him from far away. He managed to get a hold of me. He took me ground. I reversed him. I got on top. And then I just beat him from distance, kicks. He never even got close, and I won. And I was so exhausted after that fight because I didn't train for it. It was like, I think it had like 2 1-minute rounds or it was 2 2-minute rounds. I was exhausted at the end of the fight. The second guy I had to fight was one of James DeMille's guys, who was a Wing Chun guy. I remember looking at him. I was 18 years old, and I was still a kid when I was 18. This was a grown-ass man, right? And I remember he just rolled through me, put me on the ground, put his forearm in my throat, and I tapped out. But I didn't care. I was exhausted, and two, he was a Wing Chun guy. I didn't care. As long as I beat the jiu-jitsu guy, right? And then after that, I sat and talked to James DeMille, and he told me like some stories about, learning from Bruce Lee, and he talked about Bruce Lee's toolkit of Wing Chun and how he used it. And then I got one of his Wing Chun T-cell books, and he signed it for me. Alex, you did great. You'll make a great champion someday, James DeMille. And he wrote that because he saw me beat a jiu-jitsu guy, right? So it's like, so now I have that book, and that's also one of my, prized possessions, because of all the people to represent Wing Chun in front of, one of Bruce Lee's students is kind of a good showing, and I always felt good about that. And I never cared about losing to the Wing Chun guy afterwards. I was like, whatever, that's totally fine. I'm cool with that, right?
Your story about the check reminded me this story I heard from you about the blank check that Run Shaw wrote to Bruce Lee, huh?
Yes. Oddly enough, Run Shaw really screwed up when Bruce Lee came to Hong Kong, who wanted to make films. He went to Shaw Brothers first because they were the big studio. Raymond Chow's Golden Harvest was a very minor player at that point, and is actually Shaw is not even the proper name, because Shaw is like a bastardization of the Mandarin. It's actually Siu. Siu is the family name. So Siu Yat Fu is Run Shaw's name. So it's not Run, it's a Siu Yat Fu. And Siu Yat Fu handed him a standard contract, which was like peanuts, right? And Bruce was like, forget it. And then, of course, Run Shaw lived until the age of 100 and something. He lived a very long life. And I remember reading an interview, and he was one of the wealthiest men in Hong Kong. He was a genius. And so, what was one of your only regrets? And I never signed Bruce Lee. He said he didn't see it. He just saw him as a former child actor. He had no idea. And at one point, supposedly he had sent the blank check over there. And apparently Linda Lee still has it. It's a story I've heard. I don't know. There's always stories. Who knows if any of these things are true, right?
Did you ever hear this story that Bruce Lee was over at Golden Harvest with Raymond Chow, and in their viewing room, Raymond Chow shows him what at the time was their top grossing box office product.
Yes.
And at the end, Bruce Lee, Raymond Chow says, "What do you think?" And Bruce Lee says something like, "That's your best stuff." Raymond Chow says, "Yes." And Bruce Lee goes, "I can do better." Did you ever hear that story?
I did. Actually, I just want to say that my podcast partner, Sean Madigan, is in the chats starting to, go, who is this guy? And talking some nonsense in there. Although I heard the story, not that he watched it side by side with Raymond. I heard that was over the phone when he called him. Okay. And that movie was The One-Armed Boxer with Jimmy Wang Yu. And Bruce and Jimmy Wang Yu did not get along, because before Bruce Lee was hired by Raymond Chow, Jimmy Wang Yu was the big star. Raymond Chow actually stole him from Shaw Brothers when he was still on contract. And they were in legal disputes, which was draining Golden Harvest. And that's why Raymond needed that cash cow, which eventually became Bruce Lee. And so it was before Bruce Lee, Jimmy Wang Yu was the big guy there. And once Bruce Lee was there, it was like, sorry. I mean, like in rock and roll, there was a time before the Beatles and the time after the Beatles. And for Kung Fu films, there was the time before Bruce Lee and after Bruce Lee. Because when you look at the older films, I like old classic films, but Bruce Lee changed Hong Kong cinema for sure. And I
was going to ask you about that, because your first Bruce Lee viewing was Enter the Dragon, not The Big Boss, right?
Enter the Dragon, yeah.
Yeah. See, because here's the thing. I just realized something. I keep thinking that you're older than you are, which is why when I heard about the tournament, I was like, James DeMille had a jiu-jitsu tournament in the 70s? Because I was right? Because to me, you're so old school, right? But you're right, because literally, and people have heard me say this before, I watched One-Armed Boxer, One-Armed Swordsman, Return of the One-Armed Swordsman, and what have you. And when Bruce Lee started fighting in The Big Boss, I sat up and I go, what the heck is this?
Yeah.
Because the choreography completely different, right?
Absolutely. Because Bruce not only obviously he was a legit martial artist, but he had also worked on American sets for a while. So he understand about positioning, because a lot of what, I mean, everyone knows, okay, what Bruce Lee did in the films is not the same as his Jeet Kune Do. That goes without saying. But Bruce understood things like the John Wayne punch that went from one side of the screen to the other. And that's why you see he's got these, and they just look so powerful and impressive. That was his influence from American cinema, which they had not done in the Chinese cinema before. And Lo Wei, the director of Big Boss, famously hated Bruce Lee because they wanted him to do, you know, all like, you know, the kind of very operatic style. And Bruce just wanted boom, power and done. And that's why he jokingly called him Samke. It was the 3 legs. He meant that Bruce Lee only had 3 kicks and he couldn't do anything else. But later, this derogatory name that Lo Wei had for Bruce Lee became actually his nickname, because it was like he was so fast he had 3 legs coming at you. But it was originally supposed to be derogatory, like he's kind of a 3-trick pony, right? And they had no idea what they were looking at. And yeah, I mean, I've seen all the Bruce Lee films so many times, and I still watch it now, and you just go, in a way, like if I rewatch The Matrix, it's like it's totally cool, but it doesn't have that same feeling. Like when you just look at, like, you know, in Fist of Fury, when he comes in and he's just surrounded by everybody, and you see the way, I mean, that Bruce Lee had this kind of charisma that no one is ever able to replicate. They have to go in different directions to be successful, because there is only one.
Yeah. You remember the scene in Fist of Fury when the Japanese come over to the Chingwu school?
Yes.
Right? And there's all the taunting, and then Bruce Lee just goes into the fighting stance. Nothing happens.
Yes.
There's no fight, right? But when that happened, I was like, oh my God, somebody's going to die. Right?
Yes.
It just the power behind just that move, you know, no fight, just that. I was like, oh man. It's like when in Way of the Dragon, they're in the back of the restaurant, and he's about to give them the demonstration of power. So he slides into the Baizhong. Yeah. And then the uncle comes and he stops everything.
Yeah. Hey, we have customers.
Yeah.
Always ruining the fun, man.
Right? I mean, just the artistry in that, in knowing how to string the audience along like that.
Yeah. He was a genius. I mean, people forget, because to a certain degree, he was a child actor. People always forget, like people kind of know that, but it was like his nickname, Lei Xiulong, the little dragon, is not from when he became martial artist, Bruce. That was actually his nickname when he was a child. So he was Lei Xiulong when he was making those young, you know, with those films when he was very young. So he grew up on the set of films. His father was an actor. He knew, you know, Han from Enter the Dragons, the actor Sek Kin. Bruce Lee knew him when he was a child. It wasn't like he had met him the first time there. He actually knew him for a very long time. And so he grew up on the sets in a very similar way, like when Michael Jackson was very young and he would watch James Brown and from a very early age copy those movements. He grew up starting where a lot of the stars finished. That was like his starting point, his jump off point. And then you look at that, and then Bruce Lee then worked in the US, and he was also developing himself as a martial artist. He was just so savvy and so smart in a way that, even to this day, when you think of what he accomplished from a martial arts perspective, from his career or whatever, in 32 years, it's unbelievable. Like, I mean, he's really, truly one of the most remarkable human beings, I think, that's ever walked on this planet. I don't think he gets enough respect for that. They only look at his martial arts stuff.
Aren't we getting ready for another Bruce Lee documentary on ESPN, like in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, actually, one of my good friends from Hong Kong, she worked on that. She was one of the, oddly enough, it's done by ESPN. They only hired one Chinese person to be a translator for the Chinese interviews. Happens to be my friend. I know her. And I knew about this a couple years ago because they'd been working on it for a while. And I hope the documentary is good, but they had production problems. It took a while.
I don't expect much from it.
Yeah. And so
I saw the interview on the rap. I don't expect much from it.
I mean, to a certain degree, how many by the way, the best documentary on Bruce Lee is one that has never been shown openly. If you go to the Hong Kong Bruce Lee exhibit at the Shatin at the Hong Kong Heritage Museum, they have an hour-long documentary that you can only see when you go to see the Bruce Lee exhibit. And that is the best documentary ever on Bruce Lee, because it's all his childhood friends in Hong Kong and the stories they tell. These things have never been told before. I hope that when they close the exhibit this year, they release that documentary, because I guarantee it's better than this ESPN thing for sure.
Yeah. Hey, talking about Hong Kong and what have you, what's your relationship with Bay Logan?
Bay Logan is one of my old friends. I've known him for a very long time. When I was a teenager, I had his book. Because, you know, in the pre-internet days, you know, the way you found out about Kung Fu movies was not going to IMDb or Hong Kong Internet Movie Database. You had to, like, read books and stuff like that. So, and oddly enough, there were two big books, like the very first one, which is From Bruce Lee and the Ninjas Martial Art Movies, written by Rick Myers, who's now also a friend of mine. And the other big one was Hong Kong Action Cinema, written by Bay Logan. And my first time I went to Hong Kong, I was 18 years old. It was 1996. And I had that book with me. I had Bay Logan's book. I wasn't friends with Bay Logan at the time. I didn't know him. And I was in a restaurant. I went with my parents. It was my graduating from high school gift from my parents. Maybe they were excited that I graduated high school.
Oh, nice.
I had nothing but Kung Fu on the brain, right? And so they said, what do you want as a graduation present? I want to go to Hong Kong. So at 18, we go there. We stayed in a hotel in Sha Tin. I'm having breakfast one morning with my parents, and in walks Sammo Hung. And I literally completely almost lost it. And then I'm like, oh, that's Sammo Hung. And she looks, she's like, this is just some kind of fat Chinese guy over there. I'm like, no, he's one of the most major action stars in Hong Kong. He fought Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon. He's been in the blah, blah, blah. And like, I'm just like, and then I'm like, I got to go upstairs and get my book. So I ran up to the hotel room. I got my Bay Logan Action Cinema book. And you said, you know, they always say, don't meet your heroes, right? I've definitely been in situations where I met my martial art heroes and was disappointed.
Yeah.
But meeting Sammo Hung was one of the most amazing moments in my life, because I couldn't speak any Cantonese at the time. I asked the waiter, I said, could you ask Mr. Hung if I could get a autograph from him or whatever? And he went over there. He was having breakfast with his wife and a couple other people. And the waiter came back and he says, Mr. Hung says he will meet with you. He just needs about 10 more minutes to finish his breakfast, right? And I'm just like, wait, they're sitting like this. And then he came out. At that time, it was before martial law, before he had a CBS TV show. So he couldn't really speak that much English, but he tried. He went up to me and he talked I showed him the book. And then there's a whole chapter on Sammo Hung. He signed it. He took photos with me. He asked me some questions, and he was so sweet. And had you asked me 10 minutes before I met Sammo Hung, of all the Hong Kong movie stars, who would you like to meet? Jackie Chan, I would say Sammo Hung. I would have said that before, and he walked in, and like to this day is like I still can't believe it. Sammo Hung is an absolute legend, and I think that, you know, on the Mount Rushmore of Hong Kong film actors and choreography, his face is up there next to Bruce Lee and a few others for sure.
I just realized why it is that you tolerate Sean Madigan, because he's a big kung fu guy too.
He's not really a big kung fu. That guy barely knows any Bruce Lee movies. I'll be like, you know, he's the, you know, it's so funny. Like you say, I'm the Wing Chun guy. He's the Jeet Kune Do guy. I smell a sitcom, right? Because of course you would assume the Wing Chun guy and the Jeet Kune Do guy don't get along, right? And I'll be like, you know, in Fists of Fury, when he does this and he goes, is that the one with Chuck Norris? And I'm just like,
he's the worst.
How dare you, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes I feel I need to I get he's into Jeet Kune Do as a martial art, and he's, you know, into function and everything like that. And if I want to ask, if I want to know about the 5 ways of attack, I ask Sean. If I want to know, you know, about a certain sequence in the films or whatever, you don't ask Sean. He doesn't even, he doesn't know which one is which. So yeah, I always give him a little bit of a hard time about that.
Hey, when I was doing my research on you, I came across a bunch of photographs, and so I'll show you the picture, and I want you to just comment the first thing that comes to your mind. Look at this.
Oh, this is my whole life right here. My wife, my 2 kids.
Look at that.
Yeah, I mean, they're in Florida right now. So my wife and my 2 kids are in Florida visiting my parents. So they went down there to enjoy themselves, and they left me here in New York. So, you know, I spend with them every day. So I see that. It's like,
yeah. Right. Okay. Now here is the other one, because we've used the word 3 or 4 times already since we've been talking, the word father.
Oh yes, yeah.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah, that's my dad. We were in San Juan, Puerto Rico when I was, I don't know, 1 year old or 2 years old. And then we just went there
Yeah.
last year. We found the same spot and we recreated the photo, some 40 something years later. Yeah, it was huge. Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. One more. You got to give me the story behind this. I think I know a little. I deduced a little bit of it.
Oh yeah, I think we were on our way to do a Wing Chun demonstration, I think at Ellis Island. And then of course, we took the subway down to go take the ferry and, taking the long, the great thing about New York is no one really cares what you're into because everyone is in the own thing. You can walk down the street, with an eye patch and a pirate hat and a peg leg, and no one's going to look at you twice in New York, right? So there we are on the subway getting the long pole in there. And I remember some lady asked me, not on this time, but I brought the long pole a number of times on the subway. And I remember a lady asked me, she goes, "Oh, that's a very long rod you have there. What is that?" And I didn't want to say, "It's a kung fu weapon." So I'm like, "Oh, it's a curtain rod." And she's like, "You must have a huge window. Where do you live?" And I'm like, ugh. Now I have one lie. I have to make a second lie. And then I'm like, oh God, lady, I don't want to have to go in. I'm like, yeah, I live near Central Park. She's like, wow, you must have a huge window. And I'm like, yes, like, I just want to leave right now, and it's the Wing Chun poles are 8 to 10 feet long, depending. The long pole technique is called 6.5 point pole, but it's not 6.5 feet. The poles are 8 to 9 feet. It's just the technique is which means 6.5 points for the technique, not for the feet of the length or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, crazy.
That's funny because when I saw this picture, again, because we talked about what a small world it is. I flew up from Barbados to Fort Lauderdale to Merton's Marshall Market.
Okay.
Where I bought my first 6-foot staff and took it on the plane with me back to Barbados. I didn't check it as luggage or anything. I walked on board the aircraft with it, right? So I saw that picture and I was like, oh my God, that's incredible.
Yeah,
right?
Typical story.
Yeah, hey, I should check my notes because I actually have questions that I'm supposed to ask you.
Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Right. Okay. Tell me this. How come you're a Wing Chun man and not a Jeet Kune Do man?
In my time learning non-classical Wing Chun in Seattle, I was a big seeker. That's why I was trying to learn from Taki, and I wanted to see what they did. And I wanted to know what the traditional or classic Wing Chun style had, because obviously I knew as doing Bruce Lee's non-classical Wing Chun, to a certain degree, you're doing what Bruce Lee's edits of the Wing Chun system were. And it's his edits based on the things that he liked. And it's also based on what he had learned, which may not encompass all, certain aspects of Wing Chun, right? Because he learned as a teenager, he just wanted to learn how to fight, probably didn't care about certain aspects, maybe not have seen it. So I wanted to go back and be like, okay, if I go and learn for Latin, because these are always loaded terms when you say traditional or classic or whatever. I mean it in the most dispassionate way, traditional Wing Chun. I wanted to see if there was anything that I could see there that maybe I could go, okay, maybe this was something that Bruce Lee had not yet seen yet, or maybe there was something in there that I could learn. So I wanted to see for myself, if I had actually learned the traditional Wing Chun style, would I come to the same conclusion as Bruce Lee? Rather than taking his word for it, let me do the experiment myself. Yeah. And so there wasn't a lot of Wing Chun in Seattle, traditional Wing Chun. Most of the higher profile Wing Chun was through, either Jesse Glover or James DeMille or something like that. I visited a couple traditional Wing Chun schools when I was like 15, 16 years old, and had just maybe a year or 2 years of training with Sifu Johan. And that style of chi sao that is practiced in the non-classical Wing Chun style is very forward pressure dominant, one leg forward and step in, and not exactly the same. Jesse Glover was probably the most famous example of just forward pressure, just bam and just using a tremendous amount of forward pressure. But the James DeMille style was not that much different because they're from the same, time period. So I did a very heavy forward pressure style. I visited a couple of those traditional Wing Chun schools, just as kind of like, hey, I want to come and check it out. And they would always be like, oh, do you want to stick hands? And I'd be like, sure. Stupid young teenager. And I would go there and I would just step through them and they would like move backwards and they weren't used to dealing with this heavy pressure. And then I would go, yeah, I don't think this is better than what I'm doing. So then I would go to the next one, same thing. And I would basically keep kind of pushing through them and going like, yeah, I think this non-classical Wing Chun style is definitely much better than what a lot of these guys were doing, because they were having a lot of conversations about like the angle of the hand and this and that. And while I'm a total geek, I can totally geek out about that stuff. Ultimately, I'm going to try to separate your face from your consciousness. Can you stop me from doing that? Okay. Yeah. And then we could talk about how you do it afterwards. But there's sometimes too much of what I call talk fu, right? And so I wasn't convinced, but then I heard that there was one traditional Wing Chun line that they spell it WT from Leung Ting, was one of Yip Man's final students. That's very popular in Europe. And they were like, they had lots of fighters and they were fighting everyone. And it was a traditional style, but unlike a lot of these other traditional styles, those guys were actually fighting, and maybe not in a good way, maybe starting crap with other people, but at least they had a reputation for mixing it up. Whereas most traditional Wing Chun schools have a reputation for putting you to sleep with their explanations. If you ever have a hard time sleeping, just listen to some Wing Chun guy explain Tan Sao on YouTube. Because the last thing they're going to do is just show you how to use a Tan Sao. They're going to say, right. And like, hey, I'm a geek. I'm the Kung Fu genius. And that stuff puts me to sleep, okay? Yeah. So, So I went to Germany on a trip with my dad. I started doing a little bit of research, and then I found that there was a Wing Chun instructor who taught WT, the Leung Ting in Vancouver, Canada, which is about the way I drive was about a 2.5 hour drive from Seattle. Normally it takes you about 3.5, but yeah, I was 16 with my car, right? So I drove up there, and I basically did a private lesson with a WT instructor who learned in Germany. And I remember when I saw him, as the Sifu Ralph Haenel. I actually saw him again about 2 years ago for the first time in many years. And, he's from this traditional line of, Yip Man Wing Chun. And I remember seeing him, and like, he was a very unassuming German guy. He didn't look like, like this kind of typical macho or whatever. And I remember looking at him and just going like, damn it. I drove all the way to Vancouver, and I'm going to have the same experience that I had with the traditional Wing Chun guys in Seattle, which is I'm going to lock hands with him, run him over. He's going to fall backwards. And I'm going to, okay, well, I guess that didn't work. And the thing that impressed me about him is that he looked at me and he goes, I told him, I said, I'd done this non-classical Wing Chun stuff. And he seemed almost uninterested. And I was like a little bothered, like, hey, you need to know where I come from. This is a big deal. I don't do traditional Wing Chun. I do Bruce Lee's non-classical. And because I was a teenager, okay? So, and he just goes, okay, all right, so just go ahead and throw an attack at me. And I looked at him and I was like, because usually when traditional martial art guys say, okay, give me a straight punch. So they tell you exactly how to punch them, right? And it's one thing if you're teaching, you want to teach a technique, so you say, okay, do this or whatever. But it's another thing, hey, I want to show you what I can do. Just take a swing at me. Fire a punch, do whatever you want. You kick me, try to take me out, whatever you want. And he was the first traditional Wing Chun guy who looked at me and said, no, just attack me. And I'm like, and I remember going, like Wing Chun? He goes, no, I don't care. And I was like, and just thinking like, I had rarely encountered that at all. And then I'm thinking like, all right, I'm a black belt in Taekwondo. I'm going to give him a head kick because I can kick very fast. So I remember he's just standing there like looking very unassuming. And I just, boom, and I go and I throw like a very fast roundhouse kick. And I remember in hindsight, like it was in slow motion. As I took that step and my leg was there, while my leg is coming up, he just stepped in and his hand was on my face and he just pushed me back. And I was like, and he stopped me and kind of jolted me without hurting me. And I was really trying to kick him. And I was like, and what does everyone do after something like that? Let me try again. Let me try again, right? And then, I think it came out of him. I tried to do it, and he, boom, and he was just on me, and he closed the gap like a cobra striking. He was like this, and he was on me, and he closed the gap, and suddenly, his hands are there and his elbows are there, and I'm like, and I'm being smothered in a way where I'm like, whoa, this is very similar in concept to the very, close the gap swarming kind of stuff, but he's doing it with the kind of classic forms, and he's moving out of the way when I punch him, and he's doing all the things I hear Wing Chun people talking about, but I don't see them actually doing. They just have a lip service, being aggressive when he needs to be aggressive, moving out of the way when he needs to move out of the way, and I go like, whoa. And I looked at him and I go, he was essentially I love Sifu Ralph, he's amazing, but he was from his physical perspective, he was an everyman. And then I just go, oh, so because I came in there really arrogant because I thought I had figured it out, and this was just the last box I was going to tick off, and he impressed me. And then it kind of filled everything for me in terms of like, okay, now I can learn the traditional style that's also effective, not just one that talks about whatever. And then now I can go, and now I have a Wing Chun style that I feel comfortable going into because the other guys didn't really convince me. And then I just became a fanatic. I decided to go to Germany to Langenthal Castle and do it full time for 3 years, 6 hours a day. I did nothing but Wing Chun. And then, thus began my new journey in, traditional or W classic Wing Chun, whatever you want to call it. Right. And so the rest is history, as they say. Right.
And that in Germany was with Keith Kernspet?
Who was basically Leung Ting's representative for Europe. And they had set up a trainer academy in an old castle. So I told my parents, I'm like, I don't want to go to college. I want to go to Germany to do Kung Fu. Which is like insane. You go to Hong Kong to do Kung Fu. You go whatever, like, I want to go to Germany and do Kung Fu. And I just remember my parents being like, they were happy that I found something that I really liked. And I think maybe they thought it was like a phase, and they'd let me go do it, and then I'd get it out of me, and then I'd come back and then finally buckle up and, get a real job, right? And then so I went to Germany, and 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, I did nothing but Wing Chun with the top European masters. And then when I came back to New York, I was like an assistant instructor. And then because in 1 week, I had 30 hours of training. I did it for 3 years. And so when I came back to New York, then my second phase of my Wing Chun career, I started learning privately from Sifu Leung Ting. And then that kind of switched me back over to a more Hong Kong style as opposed to a European style. And I've kind of tried to blend the best of both worlds. So that's what I did.
I got to ask you a question, because didn't they have an Eskrima connection in Germany?
Yes, I like this photo here there with the with Lo Mong, the toad from Five Deadly Venoms, right? And then also to my left is Bobby Samuels, the only African American to be in the Hong Kong Stuntman Association. And he was a protege of Sammo Hung's. He's Bobby Samuels is like the man. So, and of course, Dr. Mark Cheng is in that photo too. And Dr. Mark Cheng is the godfather of my eldest daughter. So, I mean, I look at this photo and there's all sorts of people that I love in there. So, because traditionally the weapons in Wing Chun are taught very late. Grandmaster Yip Man didn't teach the weapons to all of his students. They were considered advanced. Only a certain handful of students learned the pole or learned the knife. So for that reason, they kind of buried the weapons very late in the system, which is very untraditional to Chinese Kung Fu, actually. But it's just the way it is in Wing Chun. So my Sifu was very modern and very progressive. And he wanted to make sure that people who were learning Wing Chun also had some knowledge, practical weapons knowledge. So he hooked up at that time with Rene Latoza, with the Latoza Eskrima. And then so it was taught separately. So this is the thing, people think that it was integrated. No, it was like you had Wing Chun and then you had Eskrima, and that was like church and state. But what they did is they had a weapon offering for people to get some practical weapons training, because it's maybe a pipe dream for half of them to ever learn the weapons in Wing Chun. So at least they had something that they can do weapons wise, right? And that was kind of the original justification in the old days. I didn't do that much Eskrima when I was in Germany. I got some basic competency in single and double stick. And there's me at the K. This is actually last year at my school. This is the K3 certification, which is Dr. Mark Cheng's amazing certification. And I recommend anyone to do it. I love it. I mean, for me, I'm a martial arts freak. As much as people brand me as the Wing Chun guy, I'm just as home watching an MMA fight, watching a judo match, watching a wrestling match, watching kickboxing, boxing, stick fighting. And so I love all of it. I'm just such a freak about it.
I wanted to ask you about that. How does MMA, so the fact is that today, anybody who might take a swing at you will probably also try to take you down.
Sure, absolutely.
Right? Because they see it on TV, they see it, in the movies, and they all think that they can handle it.
Yes.
So how do you take classical, traditional Wing Chun and adapt it to what people in New York need? And people in New York are just as influenced as are people around the world by MMA.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So for me, Wing Chun traditionally is a very untraditional martial art in one aspect. It's not designed to counter other martial arts by technical ideas. It's designed to use principles and concepts to counter things that can happen. All right. So that means that ultimately, if you boil Wing Chun down and you strip away all the names and the techniques and the forms and the chi sao, you're essentially using a principle-based, systematic way of dealing with aggression and violence. Now, in the old days, Wing Chun was developed to fight against northern styles, which had kind of wild swinging attacks, and other southern styles, which had short force kind of movements. So that's why in Wing Chun, you see things that are both for, wild swings and simultaneous action. And then you see a lot of fine movement, which was also against the other southern styles. So Wing Chun was traditionally meant to fight against the other styles. The problem is that at some point, people value the tradition of doing it exactly the way their Sifu did it over what the original idea of Wing Chun was, which is that you need to be able to fight against other styles. Now, we don't fight against Choi Lei Fat or Zhao Ga Tong Long, Mantis, or we don't fight against, Bak Mei or something like that. You have somebody, like you very rightly said, in the 70s and 80s, if you got in a street fight, let's say the guy wasn't a street fighter, but the guy just tried to do stuff. He tried to do some crazy kicks and punches. Why? Because that's what you see in the movies. So that's why you see like people do like crazy spin, even if they don't know how to do it. Well, nowadays, like you said, people watch MMA. So even the person who doesn't have any formal martial arts training is going to try to do something like what he sees now, right? So first of all, the style of Wing Chun I come from, the Leung Ting system. Leung Ting was very, he's a bit iconoclastic within the Yip Man lineage. He's always been a bit of a rebel and a bit of an outcast. There are photos in the Hong Kong gym, Sifu Leung Ting's Hong Kong gym, that were taken in the 60s, where they show someone on the ground and the Wing Chun guy on top grounding and pounding. Wing Chun, Sifu Leung Ting was someone who definitely understood that fights can go to the ground and you need to stop that. So there had always been a basic framework for dealing with someone trying to tackle you or take you down. Not someone with a high-level grappling skill, like who's going to go for a single leg doesn't work, change it up to a body fold, change it up to a double leg like you have now. But there definitely was always a framework to keep someone off of you, because there are Chinese wrestling styles. So Wing Chun also might have had to fight a Shuai Jiao guy or something like that, right? So within that framework, within the principles, we can now develop more nuanced responses to the way people are training nowadays. This is one of the reasons why I don't talk about it that much, but I do actually train jiu-jitsu as a total hobbyist, but I'm a snob, and I will admit it. If I want to learn Wing Chun, I want to learn Wing Chun from the best guys. If I want to learn some, like Mak Sifu in Hong Kong, he's a Hung Gar master. He's the best at certain things. I want to learn how to use a broadsword so I can improve my Wing Chun knife techniques. I go to him. I learned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from one of Renzo Gracie's best black belts. In fact, this is a guy named Magno Gama. He was one of John Danaher's training partners with John Danaher, the Danaher Death Squad. So these guys are the high end of the food chain, like all the most modern jiu-jitsu. And I train with him privately because, I want to learn how he does stuff. And I also want to ask him questions. Okay, show me your takedowns. How do you defend these takedowns? What kind of takedowns do you do? If someone does this, i.e. what I might do, what would you do, right? So I figured if I want to teach my students how to better handle, for example, someone chaining a number of takedowns, which you see in jiu-jitsu and wrestling, and not saying that I'm teaching my students who come twice a week how to, competently handle someone who's a high-level jiu-jitsu guy, but to have better competency than the traditional Wing Chun style gave us, I have to train with the best guys and make myself the guinea pig. So, and so that's what I do to improve the anti-grappling aspects of what I teach in my school. But we still use Wing Chun, the concepts, the ideas. I just have maybe a slightly better framework for doing it, because I know what it's like when those guys grab onto your neck and when those guys hold on to these gorilla-like grips. And so I can better prepare my students for that. And also, I'm half Cuban, okay, which not a lot of people know. Boxing is kind of in my blood. So I for many years, I occasionally go to Mendez Boxing down here in Manhattan and hit mitts, and I'll get a trainer. They're always some island guy from the Barbados, Dominican Republic, or something like that, and some former Golden Gloves guy, and I'll practice with them just to keep that open, so that when I'm teaching my students what someone might do, I'm not just saying what I think they might do. I have to put myself in front of a boxer, feel that, and go, okay, I need to make sure my students know this. I need to make sure I teach it this way. I need to grapple with guys who don't give a crap about Wing Chun and are like, yeah, I'm just going to take this skinny guy to the ground so I can learn it. So I try to use a scientific approach by putting myself as a guinea pig and then giving my students the benefit of my experience when I teach them. So,
you know what's funny? Somewhere out there, somebody heard about this episode 128 with Alex Richter of City Wing Chun, and they were like, what the heck is Dwight doing talking to a Wing Chun guy? This is supposed to be a Jeet Kune Do podcast.
Yes, we'll talk about Jeet Kune Do.
Right? No, except that what you just described there is Jeet Kune Do.
Right.
Your experience with your Wing Chun teacher in Vancouver was Dan Inosanto's experience with Bruce Lee in 1964, being shut down.
Yes.
In spite of all your previous experience, right?
Yes.
So
oh, sorry, I'm losing the audio. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm losing the audio on you. I just totally lost your audio. Can you still hear me? Okay, I can't hear you at all. I got no audio. Modern technology. Unbelievable. What happens here? Can you guys hear me though? I can't hear Dwight. Can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear the Kung Fu Genius? So since you can hear me, I'm just going to take over this podcast, all right? So this is now the Jeet Kune Do Dialogues with the Kung Fu Genius. So let me tell you guys what Jeet Kune Do is, all right? Because I hear you guys talking about concepts and original Jeet Kune Do. I know what's up, okay? And I'll just lay it down, all right? You're all right. All right. Cool. So I guess the consensus is that people can hear me, but they can't hear you. So I don't know if maybe you wanna pop back out and pop back in. All right. So I'm still here. I'm not going anywhere. Yeah, you know, it's all about martial arts. You have to adapt, right? This is what they call natural unnaturalness. You can hear me, so I can totally take over the narrative now, right? All right. Do it in Cantonese. All right, let's see. I'm here for I'm here for Sean, not for the other guy, dudes of Kung Fu Short. Oh, now you're back. I can hear you again. Fantastic. Okay. Cool. It's so funny. You know, I feel bad. Everyone is commenting on the side. It was great comments, by the way. It's so funny to hear what you guys are saying. Please keep it coming in, even if we don't address it right away. I think it's very funny. I'm here for Sean, not the other guy, dudes of Kung Fu shirt. I would wear that shirt, right? That's a great shirt. I tune in just for Sean. Natural unnaturalness, or unnatural naturalness. All right. Cool.
Okay, so we're good again?
We're good again, man.
All right. Okay, I had promised to get to the questions for you and what have you. Oh, you know what so the Chisao sparring pad, is that your innovation, or did somebody else?
You mean the chest protector?
Yeah.
Oh, no. I'm, you know, I'm not as much of an innovator as I know my hair looks kind of, look, by the way, this is a quarantine haircut. Look, I gave this to myself in case you couldn't tell. I am not that much of an innovator. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. So Sifu Alex had like a chest protector. When I left his association in 2011, I was also, now I can make all my own stuff. So I updated it and changed it or whatever. So yeah, but it allows you to kind of focus on the center line a little bit and to give your partner a little bit more of a whack without them getting upset.
Right. Yeah. And like I was saying before we got cut off, what you described as your journey with boxing, with jujitsu, that's Inosano's journey, and he gets so much flack.
Yes.
You know, he gets so much crap from people to this day, right? So we know a lot about the controversies in Jeet Kune Do. Can
Right.
you tell me about some of the controversies in Wing Chun?
There are none. Everyone in Wing Chun gets along fine.
Oh, okay, that's what I thought.
We never argue about anything. Everyone is like, Wing Chun guy looks at another Wing Chun guy. Nah, his form's good. His bong sao's correct. No problem. I have no idea what you're talking about. The Jeet Kune Do, you know, it's funny. You ever see that meme when people start fighting in like comments going back and forth? And invariably one person will post that one of Michael Jackson eating the popcorn. Like when two people start fighting. So I'm basically that guy. Like, obviously, I've been doing Wing Chun for a long time. I know about all the Wing Chun politics. I don't really partake in it, but every once in a while, even if you just make a statement, people, you know, people frame it like you're attacking them, even if it's just my viewpoint or whatever. I love sitting and watching your dialogues because, you know, I've been up to date on the Jeet Kune Do controversies for eons, because that's nothing new, even for me as an outsider. But I'm definitely like Michael Jackson eating the popcorn and watching some of the comments between like people going back and forth. I love this stuff. Yeah, I mean,
it's
you know,
amazing.
the problem, I think the problem with most traditional Chinese martial arts is as follows. The traditional Confucian framework of which Chinese martial arts are based on, the hierarchy of the Sifu is the patriarch and all those things. The dark side of that is that there's certain controlling aspects about it. And in the old days, see, Chinese Kung Fu, the way it's traditionally taught, is not set up to really match the way martial arts are taught nowadays. It needs to be redeveloped. And I say that, I don't mean the actual physical martial arts. I mean, in the old days, a Sifu didn't really teach for a living. Teaching martial arts was never like a profession. I remember, you know, my wife is from Hong Kong, and when she, you know, she was a lawyer from Hong Kong, like, you know, from Hong Kong University, top law school, like, you know, worked at a huge law firm or whatever, has to tell her parents that she's going to quit being a lawyer and move to America to be with a white Kung Fu instructor. And then it's like, you know, what does Alex do? Oh, he teaches Kung Fu. No, we mean, what does he do for a living? So in general, even Hong Kong, the idea is that if a Sifu teaches martial arts in Hong Kong, it's normally a side gig because Hong Kong is so expensive. It's very difficult to earn a living teaching martial arts. And Chinese people in Hong Kong really don't give a crap about martial arts anymore. For the most part, don't get me wrong. Don't get upset if you are a Chinese person from Hong Kong and you do like Chinese martial arts. You are clearly the exception, and I'm not talking to you. But in general, you know, Hong Kong Chinese view Chinese martial arts the way we view rodeos in America. Yeah, it'd be cool to use a lasso, but no one's going to learn that crap. So anyway, the problem is that in the old days, a Sifu, one of the things he has to do besides teach his students properly is he has to pass the style on to a qualified successor, because in Confucianism, he or she has to do that to appease their ancestors. Because if you are handed this body of knowledge, this Kung Fu style, and you do not pass that on to a worthy successor, and it essentially dies with you, you're going to have hell to pay in the afterlife because you essentially squandered one of the gems that your ancestors gave to you. So that's why there's a little bit of pressure to find a successor. And in the old days, when you only taught 6 to 10 people your entire life, well, they're a very close-knit group of students. You know what they know. And eventually, after your lifetime, you go, this is the guy or gal who knows all my stuff. And you pass it on to them. And now it's their burden. You don't only pass a style, you pass on their burden. All right? Bruce Lee always used the term burden. You know, like to kind of, you know, don't put the instructor's burden on the students, right? I think this was him exorcising some of the demons of the Confucianist, you know, concept that's in Chinese martial arts, right? That essentially a Chinese Sifu passes the buck of their burden and then dies. And then it's like, and now it's yours, I can die, right? And so it's very, very heavy. The problem is, if a Sifu appoints a successor, let's say a Sifu has 15 students, and these 15 students are all pretty good, but the Sifu says, but this one person is the successor. Did the Sifu now just nullify the credentials of the other 14? It's a problem. Yeah. Because while he might say this person is the one that should take it on the next generation, he also, let's say, has 14 other students who are qualified enough to teach. Does appointing a single successor nullify the credentials of everyone else who's also a high-ranking student? Now, the opposite problem. The Sifu decides, I'm not going to appoint a successor. And then they die. And now what? So the problem is this, we've been through this experiment before in Chinese Kung Fu systems that appointed a successor, like, for example, the Eagle Claw style, and Chinese Kung Fu systems that didn't appoint a successor, i.e. Wing Chun, and it's both a mess because they both have the same problems of seniority, authority, and Confucianism being the top conversation over who really knows it the best, who can teach it the best. It becomes, Sifu said the Tanzao is supposed to be like this. No, screw you, told me it was like this. No, it was like this. And it's only conversations about things. And no one ever has a conversation of substance. I spend most of my time not talking to other Wing Chun people because they infuriate the living crap out of me. When you, the Jeet Kune Do Dialogues wants to have me on, great. You know why I want to do it? Because you're not a Wing Chun person, and I'm happy to. Do you know why I have a podcast with Sean, who also practices Wing Chun? Probably the fact that he practices Wing Chun is probably the part that annoys me the most. But he's a Jeet Kune Do guy, and I can deal with it, right? I would much rather have a conversation with a boxer, an MMA guy, a jiu-jitsu guy, or a Kung Fu practitioner of another style than sitting across from another Wing Chun person who pretends to sell a brag. And, I just like it. For me, it's like, yeah.
Now, but what I'm doing is I'm weeding out the Jeet Kune Do people who are worth speaking to. That's what I'm doing.
Right.
So by the time I'm done, right, everybody will be able to say, "Oh, yeah, I saw that guy talking to Dwight. He's worth the time."
Absolutely.
That guy, yeah, that's what I'm. That's my job.
Yeah, you had Sifu Richard Torres on last time. That was great. I mean, I love those conversations. I think those are fantastic. Those are the kind of people I mean, here. Yeah.
The thing is, somebody I forget who it was, but somebody was complaining that I only ever have Inasano people on, and I'm thinking he must be watching a goddamn different program from what I do. What the heck is this only Inasano? Since when, right? Since when was Richard Torres an Inasano guy?
Right.
When did Sean Madigan become an Inasano guy?
Sure.
I mean, it's so
except for those guys.
right. Except for them. So now here's the other thing. How do you learn to run a school?
Well, as you know, and I also listened to, I don't know if it was the last episode you did or the one before, where you talked a little bit about, you have your basic curriculum and then your full 3-year program and all that kind of stuff, which is essentially the framework that most successful martial arts schools in the States use, whether it's a belt system or a ranking system. You have like a framework of which you want people to be dedicated and dedicate some time, right? And that entire framework essentially works for most martial art styles, but most people say, well, that wouldn't work for my style. My style's too hardcore. My style's too this. And the thing is, they just don't want to go through the exercises of going, how can I apply this very successful framework to my ultra traditional or ultra hardcore, super hardcore fight style? Because you can do it. And so teaching martial arts is very much a matter of having business systems that are proven and work. And also, and I've talked about it with Sean before, it's about having what you call the third place culture, because people spend time in 3 places. All right.
That's Starbucks.
Yes, Starbucks, right? Work,
yeah,
home, and some other place. All right.
Right.
And a lot of martial arts schools, because of the way they're set up, it's not necessarily their fault. You go, you show up for your class, get out, right? Or you go to a yoga school, you go, get out, right? And so, and sometimes you have to do that because maybe you rent a space, it's not your space. I mean, there's reasons for it, right? My school, we have set class time. We have a 2-floor school in Midtown Manhattan. And so we open we're pretty much open most of the day. I mean, not during quarantine, but like in the before time. And so the students, they get off work and maybe it's still another 2 hours before class. Our students come, they just start hitting bags. They start doing their forms. They start, doing sparring with other partners, and they just come. We have Wi-Fi at the school. We have drinks. They can come, and it becomes that third place. And that sense of community is probably one of the reasons that people really come. People get too stuck in the weeds of like the reason why people come is because I'm the best Wing Chun guy, or I'm the best whatever guy, right? It's like, yeah, people come to you because you have some experience, but a lot of people come to you because you're the martial arts school that's right next to where they work, and you're the one that's providing them with the great benefits that they want, whether it's confidence, fitness, whatever, independent of your style. And I think if martial art instructors make it more about the student experience, that the students feel better about themselves after class, they get a good workout, and of course they learn the martial art and become more competent in the style, then you have a better success formula than when you just become a dogma peddler. And many of my Wing Chun, not all of them, but some of my Wing Chun competitors in the New York area are dogma peddlers. And that couldn't make me more happy, because I know ultimately that's not going to take anyone from me, because it's kind of culty, right? And so like, you guys can have your weird cult. I'm a much more approachable person, and I hope that people feel that in my school. So atmosphere is the number one thing for me, I think, in terms of success.
What's your most favorite and your least favorite type of student?
My well, I love all students who come to me. Of course, I have to say that. No, actually, you know what? My opinion on that has changed, because when you hear me pontificate about how atmosphere is the most important thing or whatever, you are looking at me after teaching martial arts for 18 years. In 2002, when I started teaching, I was not like this. I was a card-carrying member of Learning Things Association, and I was like, people would come into my school, maybe from another Wing Chun school, and they'd be like, "Oh, let's stick some hands." I'm like, "Okay, come on, you want?" Like, I was very like, you want to test me, bro? And so I had a much different attitude, right? And the students I had at that period tended to. Now I had lots of great students from that time period still around today. But I realized I had a very nasty atmosphere in my school, because I wanted all of my students to be fighters. And if other Wing Chun people came, I wanted them to represent. And I realized after a couple of years, I had a school full of meatheads. I looked around and I didn't have like the erudite people that I want to teach martial arts to. I had a bunch of kind of mouth breathing, like, and always like, oh, if someone comes in and says something about Sifu or whatever. And I realized I was surrounded by people I didn't like, and I had to make a change. And so that process came over time. At that point, if you ask me, who's your favorite student, who's your least favorite student? Yeah, I would say the student who's talented, or the student who trains hard, or who's really into it. And the one that's not so talented, I'm not that interested in. But it took me a couple of years, because I thought I was teaching people how to fight with Wing Chun. And one day a student came into my office and said, Sifu, I just want to let you know that before training in your school, I didn't have the confidence to ask my boss for a raise. And now I've been training with you for 9 months, and I just went in there and asked my boss for a raise, and he gave it to me. And I realized that I was starting to kind of talk like Bruce Lee, to impose my burden on the students. I'm into Wing Chun. I want my students all to be good at Wing Chun, but maybe they came to me because they just needed to feel better at the end of the day. They work 8 hours for a boss that they can't stand. They need a third place. And I started to realize that people were telling me like they had the confidence to leave abusive relationships, or that they just felt better about themselves walking down the street, or that they lost weight and it made them feel good. And I realized that they weren't there necessarily for the same reason I was there, but what I was doing for them was providing them great service. So now I would tell you, my favorite student is the one that comes and wants to improve their life. And my least favorite student is the talented student that has, unfortunately, no drive. In all my years, I've never been more disappointed by physical phenoms who joined my school and just didn't have that thing to stick with it. They had all the physical gifts I never had and wish I had. And so a talented student with no drive is more disappointing than an uncoordinated student that comes and tries. I love that guy, because God bless him, he's coming and trying. The one that squanders their talent infuriates me, because all they need to do is train hard, and training hard and having discipline is free. The talent they have is a gift. The discipline is free, and they don't have that. And so I'm squandered talent for me is the thing that always makes me, that's the one that stabs my heart when I look back and think of the people who, you know, came and I could have been a contender. And they didn't. And then that's the thing that just kills me, because I was never the most physically gifted. When I went to Germany to train Wing Chun, I was literally the runt of the litter. I am, as I like to tell my students, the whitest Cuban and the shortest German in one person, okay? My father is 6'2". My German family towers over me, including my aunts. My Cuban family, all the Cuban men in my family look like proper Cuban men with, you know, the Cuban skin and hair and look very dashing or whatever, right? I don't look like anyone on either side of my family. I took the worst. I'm as white as a German and as short as a Cuban. I took the worst from both sides. And so when I trained in Germany, I was like, everyone I looked around was like this. So I was the runt of the litter. So I had people constantly trying to pummel on me, and that was good because it served me well when I came to New York, where we got lots of big guys, and I was used to training with big guys for years. And so everything I got, I had to work hard for. I didn't get good at Wing Chun because I went to Germany. I got good because I worked my ass off, and I still work I train every day like a maniac. People see me talk about, like, this morning when I got up, I did 5 rounds of rowing with push-ups in between. I did a live workout for my students, which was the Boss Rutan workout at 12. And I did all sorts of other Wing Chun training. And today was a light day because I have to be an example. And Chinese Kung Fu and Wing Chun in particular, and this is what I loved about Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do philosophy, that the Jeet Kune Do person also needs to take care of themselves, which was the philosophy in Chinese Kung Fu. But so many Wing Chun people are out of shape, which, and they say, I don't need to be in shape because my technique is so good. Well, you know what? If you should be in shape for your health, not because it makes you a better Wing Chun person, but having a little bit of mobility and stuff is not a bad thing. And so students are looking to me, and I realize I cannot just talk the talk. I need to walk the walks. I'm the leader of a school. I'm the leader of an association, and a lot of people are looking at me as their source of inspiration, and I'm not going to stand there and pretend. I have to do it. And so that's how I kind of put myself through it. I give myself a little bit of external pressure to I don't know if you feel this. I think that everyone who's really into something feels, what do they call it? They call it impostor syndrome. Like, you teach for many years, and then you always feel like, am I really like you sometimes go like, you know, am I really the guy that people should be looking to? Because I still look to so many people, and I don't feel that I'm there yet. And I still feel like a student that is like here. And now people look at me that way, and you feel like occasionally I get riddled with anxiety. And then I realize I need to let my students know that it's all about the process, and it's about never stopping to be a student and always learning.
Yeah. You know, so let me ask you this. What is your thought on this? About, you're supposed to be a Wing Chun guy, but everything that you've talked about is JKD to me. Right? It all is. It's the same journey.
Yes.
It's the same journey. So let me try to formulate that into a question.
Go ahead.
What's your opinion on the statement, there could never have been Jeet Kune Do if Bruce Lee had never trained Wing Chun? What's your opinion on that?
I definitely agree with that, because I mean, simply from a historical perspective, you know, like, not to quote Dragon the Bruce Lee story, because that's about as fake as it comes, but you drop the pedal and then the ripples go, right? So, okay, you know, learning Wing Chun was dropping that initial pebble, right? Okay. I laugh about that because somebody quoted something that the Yip Man character in Dragon the Bruce Lee movie said, and put it on a meme with the actual Yip Man. I was like, what? Anyway, that's the topic for another day. So a couple of things I have to say about that. Wing Chun gets a little bit of a bad rap, and I'm going to be quite honest, because of Jeet Kune Do people. Because, you know, to a certain degree, you know, Bruce Lee found the limitation in Wing Chun, and therefore he had to develop himself in, you know, beyond the limitation of Wing Chun. And I certainly understand that, right? On the other hand, you know, people say, well, you know, I mean, Bruce Lee learned Wing Chun for like 3 years as a teenager, and then he had to move to the States, and he had to develop himself in the way that he did. And given what Bruce Lee knew in Wing Chun and what he did, there are people who learn the entire Wing Chun system and don't have nearly the understanding and breadth and depth of Bruce Lee with his less Wing Chun, but he developed it to a very high level, philosophically, physically, all these kind of things. But if you actually learn Wing Chun as a complete system from a very competent Sifu, you will find that ultimately, man, I sound like Bruce Lee, ultimately, the end goal in Wing Chun is to move organically according to the way your opponent moves. We begin with forms and formulas, and we move to formlessness. And essentially, every traditional martial art, that was the original idea. But they got stuck in the training methods, preserving the training methods as museum pieces, and the training methods became the Kung Fu instead of the skill that is the result of the training methods. And that's why so many Chinese Kung Fu people talk about the way you do the drill, the way you do this, the way you do that, and they're not talking about what's the purpose of it. What are you trying to get out of it? And so I find that if you learn a traditional Chinese martial art from a competent Sifu, you would naturally come to an idea that, ultimately, I can't stand in a certain, I have to be able to adapt according to how my opponent moves. Every good martial art does that. So I find that that's also part of Wing Chun, even if Jeet Kune Do people think that Bruce Lee was the one who, Bruce Lee came up with that, maybe not knowing that high-level Wing Chun people also do that. So there's that. And also the longtime line I come from is also really about application and about putting it together. And let me not forget what I said at the beginning. Since I was 8 years old, I started reading I read Bruce Lee's fighting method, I didn't know. I was a karate guy. I was like, what is timing? What do you mean, like lead and box? I didn't know any of that stuff, but I still read it like a maniac. I would just read it and read it. I had no idea what I was reading, but I read it. And so for me to go now and talk about how free my expression is and my worldview is of Wing Chun, I would be 100% lying to you if I didn't tell you it was influenced by because of what I read this guy behind me, right? 100%. Yeah. I'm not an innovator. I'm standing on the shoulders of many giants. He is one of them for sure. Because
you know, I have my notes, and then you'll say something, and I get like 3 more ideas for questions, but then I want to keep my eyes on the clock because you and Sean only go for like an hour, so I know you don't have this kind of stamina, right?
No. I don't have this stamina to go this long with Sean. That's what you don't understand. I'm more or less. So Sean and I, we're gonna record our podcast over the weekends because normally we record on Friday nights, but I told him I couldn't do it. So I'm free. Take your time.
Well,
take your time.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Did you ever hear, because they make a big deal about this in JKD circles, that Bruce Lee said to somebody or wrote to somebody, and his words were something like, "Cheese out is out." Did you ever hear about that?
Yeah, I also heard that had something to do with training with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and just getting frustrated. Which I can imagine. I saw Kareem Abdul-Jabbar once at JFK, and he was there you go. That's so great. Yeah. Not the most flattering photo. What people don't realize is the JKD tracksuit, great in theory, put one of those things on and you go, yes.
Never. No,
because all I'm going to say without revealing too much is it's got to go to one side or the other. Okay. And that's all I'm going to say about the JKD tracksuit. So
I'm way too modest to ever put that crap on.
I got off the plane once at JFK. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was like in the terminal and he was squatting down, tying his shoe, kneeling down, and he was eye level with me. And I remember, and then he stood up. And it was bizarre because it was just like that scene in Game of Death. And he looked up and I just craned my neck looking at him. And remember, I'm exactly 5'7", like Bruce Lee, and just looking at him and going. And I remember in that moment, the thing, cheese, I was out. And I go, Yeah, that's rough. That's a rough one right there, right? I can imagine that, because even Kareem Abdul-Jabbar talked about how Bruce Lee sometimes struggled with certain range issues. And I can imagine that Chisao was one of those fundamental problems. Of course, he was using maybe Kareem Abdul-Jabbar to figure out the puzzle, right? Because this is the most extreme example, right? But I can imagine that, right? Yeah. So what do you want me to say about Chisao being out?
Well, no, I mean, again, it is one of the controversies in JKD, right?
Yes.
And as you were talking about, here's another one, because as you were talking about Bruce Lee and Wing Chun, I heard that all the fighting that you'll ever need to learn in Wing Chun is contained in Sunam Dao.
Yeah, I would argue. Well, I mean, it depends on the instructor. Okay.
Okay.
But usually we say Sunam Tao and Chum-Kyu is the foundation. BUG is a special study for certain situations, and Wooden Dummy is finishing school in terms of the traditional path as far as that goes. It all depends on the instructor. So I'm very good friends with Bruce Lee's Si Heng. I'll say it in Chinese way, Si Heng. It's two high-level tones. It's not Si Heng. Si Heng, Si Heng, right? And so his Si Heng is Chen Qi Man, Chan Chi Man. And Chen Chi Man, he started learning Wing Chun in the very early period. He's still alive today. He's a very dear friend of mine. He is the oldest, most senior student of Grandmaster Yip Man alive in Hong Kong today. And he was there before Bruce Lee started, and he knew Bruce Lee. He had even out with Bruce Lee. He was very close to Wong Sun Leung. And every time I go to Hong Kong, I go to Chan Sifu's home, and he tells me stories, and it's just amazing because like what he's able to tell me. And one of the things that I'm infinitely fascinated by is that Grandmaster Yip Man had more or less 3 periods, right? Although anytime you say there were 3 periods of teaching, it's not true. There are multiple periods in between and things change. But the big picture is, okay, you had an early period, a middle period, and a final period. The early period students of Grandmaster Yip Man, no one knew what Wing Chun was in Hong Kong at that time. So Grandmaster Yip Man needed his students to go out and make a name by either accepting challenge fights or going out and mixing it up. So the first generation of Yip Man students, they had a lot of practical fighting experience fighting the other guys. But this also meant that Yip Man, for the most part, especially not so much the adults, but the teenagers, because people say, oh, his first generation, they were all fighters. Not the adults. The adults have normal jobs. You're not going to teach them to fight. They have families. They're going to get in trouble. The teenagers, the teenage boys that learned from Grandmaster Yip Man, they were the ones that he taught to fight. And I asked, because Chen Chi Man was one of them. He had challenge fights and all that stuff. So I asked him, how did Grandmaster Yip Man do it at that time? And he says, well, at that time, they just did the Sunam Tao very slowly, maybe for 9 months or 6 months, nothing else. But Grandmaster Yip Man made them hit the wall bag and taught them how to do steps and punches and to storm in and close the gap. So what people often forget is that to have basic fighting competency, it's not a matter of knowing 80 different moves. And even Wing Chun, modern Wing Chun people struggle with this, where they talk about, oh, how many moves and how many sections and how many this they know. A fight, one punch to the face can end a fight. That's one move, okay? People forget, and so Tantiman, he always says, later he had the chance to learn all the advanced technique from Grandmaster Yip Man privately, including the knives and the pole and the dummy. But in the early days, they only learned the fighting skill of Wing Chun, the stripped down, close the gap, chain punch, front kick, stay on them, don't give them any space. And that's essentially what most of those guys were armed with, like including Bruce Lee. They didn't know that many advanced techniques, but they didn't need them. They knew the high percentage functional part of Wing Chun that you need for 99% of the situations. That other 1% you need against a Jiao Ga guy or a Choi Le Fut guy, a very specific situation. So very interesting, because Chan Chi Man told me something I didn't know about Grandmaster Yip Man at that time. He always says, because in Hong Kong, they speak British English, which I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with. Sometimes the Hong Kong Chinese, when they speak English, they'll throw out these British isms, which as an American, it's always kind of funny. He would say, Yip Man was very cheeky, cheeky, right? We don't call people cheeky in American English. He was very cheeky, right? And he said, Sometimes in the middle of Chisao, Grandmaster Yip Man randomly would boom, he would pop a squat and do like a low punch and come over the top and essentially do this very famous combination that comes from the Choi Lei Fut style, because those were the styles that they were fighting then. And he would occasionally, when they were walking down the street, he said Grandmaster Yip Man was like a child, even though he was this, everyone looks at him as this very kind of respectful senior, but when he was close to his students, they said he would sometimes randomly attack them with a punch to see how they would react. But he would use non-Wing Chun punches and non-Wing Chun movements because he knew that he wasn't preparing his students to fight against other Wing Chun people. He was preparing his students to fight against the other Kung Fu styles. And so that was a characteristic that was prevalent among the early period students. Now Grandmaster Yip Man establishes his name and reputation. The second wave, they can learn more about the refined technique and learn all this stuff because they don't necessarily need to go out and punch people in the face because now Wing Chun has a reputation. So there's also a bit of a transition. And think about it, Bruce Lee came from the tail end. Sometimes people want to brand Bruce Lee as a middle period student because late 50s, and they want to do that because the middle period students were maybe more technical, but Bruce Lee was he was a late early period student of Grandmaster Yip Man. And so he came from that era of, we're going to go out and try this. Right. And they didn't care about whether the tan sao on the wooden dummy was exactly the way the old man did it. They just didn't want to lose to their buddy who was a Choi Lei Fut guy. So they had a lot more kind of personal investment for their ego to get good at it. So we're looking at different ways the art was taught over the time period. And it wasn't until I started to talk to these different Sifus that I realized everything is on a continuum. What someone learns in this time period is different than this time period, and it's not better or worse. We need to look at different time periods, whether we're talking about Wing Chun or Jeet Kune Do, dispassionately, and look at them as objectively as we can and see what we can learn from these different waypoints, rather than say, well, because I come from this time period, therefore this is the only correct expression, so on and so forth. We can literally learn from all sorts of people, even if we learn that we don't want to do it that way, but that's education nonetheless. So yeah, it's kind of how I look at it. I don't know. I think I took your question and then like garbled it up.
No, because contained in your answer is a lesson that JKD people really need to hear, because you cannot get them to drop these ideas about Seattle versus Oakland versus Los Angeles, right? You cannot get them to drop it. And I keep trying to tell them, listen, man, we all have the same root. We're all here for the same, initial reason, right? And that reason being, I mean, look over my shoulder, look over your shoulder, right? A black guy that grew up in the islands and lives in Florida, right? And a Cuban German, that I mean, we got the same thing over our shoulder. Come on.
Absolutely.
Right?
Oh, give me a moment. I just want to turn the light on because it's getting a little dark, and my white complexion cannot always brighten every room at some point.
All right. I really appreciate him taking this time, but I really, now I'm starting to feel bad. I'm looking at the clock. I'm starting to feel bad because I will do this all night. Right? Sure. Okay, let me ask you this. Is this the progression then? Sunam Dao, Chung Kyu, Buji, Muk Jung, Chi Sao, and then I forget what you call the pull. But is that the order? Is that the progression for teaching?
Yeah. So I mean, it's always difficult. The moment I say this is how you do it, some other Yip Man goes, well, actually, in my school, right? So it's like, so I can speak from my lineage, and then also because I've talked to people from the different types of from the different periods of Grandmaster Yip Man. See, what I do is I go, okay, this is how we do it in my lineage. This is how he does it, how he does it, how he does it, how he does it. And then what I do is I kind of go for the common denominators among all of them. So if I speak broadly, I try to say things that actually apply to everyone, unless I'm telling you I'm specifically speaking of my line. So in general, okay, so now I'm speaking broadly, okay? And of course, there are always going to be exceptions. See how good I am at hedging everything I say before? You have to make yourself attack-proof, right?
You might be a New York politician.
Exactly, right? in general, although, mileage may vary in your particular school, usually you learn the Sunam Tao first. Alongside learning the Sunam Tao, you would learn your basic training, maybe some simultaneous actions, wall bag punching, and single arm chi sao, because single arm chi sao reflects the one arm focus of the Sunam Tao. Then you learn the second form. And of course, so at the same time, you learn some basic applications, simultaneous movements, how to defend this, that, the other thing. And then you learn the Chumkyu form. And then because the Chumkyu form has a two-hand focus, that's usually when you start learning double arm chi sao. It's a Chumkyu stage. So you're learning these alongside the forms, including the fighting techniques and the sparring and the chi sao sparring. When you have competency in the basic operating system of Wing Chun, which is Sunam Tao and Chumkyu, and how to use that stuff in fighting and in chi sao, and your Sifu likes you, then you can learn Biuji, right? Because Biuji was not taught to everyone. I mean, everyone's like, you go on YouTube, everyone's learned Biuji, but not everyone learned Biuji. We know this. So then you learn the Biuji form, and then of course, when you learn the Biuji form, you would also learn, it's not just learning the form. You have to learn the form, the applications, how to do it in chi sao, and then how to put it into the bigger picture, right? Not separate, but it has to come into the whole. We cannot fight, you cannot have a separation of the totality or whatever, to sound very Jeet Kune Do-y, right? And then normally after you completed Biuji, then you would learn the formal wooden dummy techniques. Now, that doesn't mean you didn't already use the wooden dummy. Sometimes in the early period, your Sifu might have you do some basic moves on the wooden dummy or use the wooden dummy for training, but that's not the same as learning the official form or learning the official techniques, right? So we always have to differentiate between training on the wooden dummy and learning the wooden dummy techniques. These are two different things. Okay. However, some of Grandmaster Yip Man's middle period students, they learn the first half of the wooden dummy before they learn Biuji. But there was a reason for that. Grandmaster Yip Man, in some certain time periods of his life, had personal issues. He had, let's say, a girlfriend whom his students did not like because they felt that their Sifu was a dignified Chinese gentleman. And by the way, if anyone feels that this is controversial, what I'm saying, everyone in Hong Kong knows this, all right? So if you're hearing it from me from the first time, don't be shocked and just understand everyone knows this. This is old news. So Grandmaster Yip Man came to Hong Kong without his wife. Now, I don't know whether she stayed there or she had passed. I don't quite know that. I could find out, but I never really cared. Anyway, he got a girlfriend, and the students did not like her because his girlfriend was much younger than him, and she was perhaps formerly a woman of ill repute. That's all I'm going to say, all right, to keep it very PC. And they thought that she was very unbecoming of their Sifu. In fact, Chan Chi-man told me at one point, all the students hated her because they thought she was a bad influence. She also had, unfortunately, she had an opium habit. And the old man used to smoke opium back in the day. And she, let's say, exacerbated his opium issue. And so they wrote a letter and they're like, you got to get rid of her because otherwise we're going to leave. Like the students were vocal. And for traditional Chinese students to tell their Sifu that they don't like their girlfriend, they must have really not liked her. So anyway, there was a time period where Grandmaster Yip Man, unfortunately, was really in the clutches of a relatively bad opium addiction. And as a result, he handed over most of the teaching of the classes to many of his senior students because he, unfortunately, was not in the right mind to teach. So that's why certain swaths of people who learn from Grandmaster Yip Man actually learn from maybe their Sihangs much more than they learn from him because the old man, and I use the old man in the most respectful term. In Chinese, when you call someone an old man, it's actually very respectful. So like, I don't want people to say like, the old guy, right? I mean it in a very respectful way. The old man had some issues. And so sometimes in order to keep students staying, he would teach them the wooden dummy techniques, which were traditionally taught very late, to be like, okay, pay me this and I'll teach you the wooden dummy. So that would actually indicate why he would sometimes teach some of these things in the earlier before they finished Biuji. But sometimes some of his students learned a little bit of long pole, even if they didn't learn the whole thing. Say, okay, I'll teach you some long pole. You just pay me a little bit of money. So that is also the reason why sometimes there are discrepancies within when people learn what, because sometimes he was in situations where he taught some advanced program for cash, because he had some issues. And Richard Torres says, hey, that's not in the movie IP Man. No, that's not in it. Although the movie Yip Man, The Final Fight with Anthony Wong does touch on the Shanghai woman very briefly. So
yeah. I've noticed that you always refer to it as IP Man. Is that out of derision?
A little bit, okay. Because the spelling of Yip Man's name, look, and this is another reason why I don't like hanging out with Wing Chun people, because they spend inordinate amounts of time trying to argue about the correct spelling of Yip Man's name. Now, in Cantonese, it's pronounced Yip Man, not Yip Man, Yip Man.
Right.
2 6 tones low level, Yip Man. Yip is the lowest tone. It's a 6th tone, the same tone as Jeet from Jeet Kune Do. It's not Jet or Jeet, it's Jeet. Jeet is the lowest tone. Jeet Kune Do. That's actually all on the lower level. There's no high tones. Jeet Kune Do. And Yip Man is Yip Man. And the most phonetically accurate way to spell that is with a Y. Now, there's some controversy because Yip Man on his ID card at one point had IP. But if you look at his ID card, it says IPYAT, Ip Yat. It doesn't even say Yip Man. His full name is Yip Gai Man. So actually, it wasn't even his correct name on this ID card. And based on that, everyone's like, no, you have to spell it IP Man, all right? You know, and of course, they spell it IP and you pronounce it Yip. But the joke is some people who don't know who Yip Man is look at that and say IP Man. So I kind of joined in on the joke. It's spelled Yip Man. Now, until 1990, everyone and their sister spelled it YIP, including, as Richard Torres points out, including Bruce Lee. It's the most phonetically accurate. Grandmaster Yip Man actually formed his own association in 1972, and you can see the public record. He spelled his name YIP, but his ID card had IPYAT. And the reason that a lot of people say, someone say your geek is showing. And the reason why a lot of people see that was the way he spelled it is when Grandmaster Yip Man left mainland China, he was about to be persecuted for being a member of the Kuomintang party. Grandmaster Yip Man was a member of the opposing party to the Communist Party. When they took over in 1949, Yip Man was essentially blacklisted because he was a member of the ousted Kuomintang party. And this is the reason why he had to jet out, because he was literally, the next day, they were going to put him in jail. He fled China and went to Macau, and then from Macau went to Hong Kong. There is speculation that when Yip Man came to Hong Kong, he was so nervous about still being caught by the Chinese, even though he was in the safe haven of Hong Kong, that he intentionally misspelled his name in his ID card. That's why it says Ip Yat, which is not even, it's not, his name was Yip Gai Man, not Ip Yat. So everyone's like, oh, it's Ip Man. His ID card was totally wrong, right? And there are people who have the surname Yip who do spell it IP. Don't get me wrong. I mean, there's no standardized way to spell Cantonese. So it's not wrong that people with the surname spell it IP. But, and I'm not going to say who it is because you want to talk about controversy. It was one dude in the early 90s who decided, no, it's spelled IP. And he convinced someone, perhaps someone related to Yip Man, to say that's actually how it should be spelled. And that person who was related to Yip Man, who also spelled their name YIP, might I add, changed it from one day to the next. And now if you don't spell it that way, you are wrong. And someone hijacked the narrative. And I am team Yip YIP until the day I die.
Yeah. The other thing that came up, I just remembered this one. You tell me why. How was Bruce Lee, a non-boxer, able to defeat Gary Elms?
That's a very good question. So, it's remarkable because Gary Elms wasn't I mean, obviously we're talking about like intra-high school boxing team, which is funny because imagine like, and when you saw, they didn't even have headgear. So it's like in the 50s, they have like teenagers punching each other in boxing rings with like normal boxing rules, and like CTE, whatever. No one had ever heard of that, right? So, remember that actually, when you look at the date that Bruce Lee had the fight with Gary Elms, which I believe was 1958. I believe so. Bruce Lee left Hong Kong in 1959. Right. So we're looking at him more on the tail end of his Wing Chun training, where he had already had a number of street fights. And don't forget, what people don't realize, Bruce Lee had a number of fights before he started learning Wing Chun. He was essentially kind of a bit of a bad apple, right? He got kicked out of La Salle, which is a very prestigious private school, for pulling a knife on the PE teacher, okay? Because Bruce grew up in essentially upper middle class in Hong Kong with a lot more money than many of his classmates. And he went to private schools in Kowloon Tong, which is a very expensive area, rather than going to the public schools that were in the Yau Ma Tei, Jordan area, because he lived on the border of Yau Ma Tei, Jordan in Kowloon, but went to school in Kowloon Tong, which is like where the rich kids are, where all the private schools were, because his father very wisely invested in real estate during the Japanese occupation. And when it cost nothing to buy property in Hong Kong, and suddenly when the Japanese were out and Hong Kong started to rebuild, Lei Hoi Chun, a poor actor, was now a landlord, and that's why they had a relatively, let's say, upper middle class lifestyle above where a lot of people were post-war Hong Kong, and that gave Bruce Lee certain advantages. Anyway, right. People say, one of the reasons why he wanted to learn Wing Chun is because he picked a fight with William Cheung, who was one of his classmates, and he couldn't beat that guy, and he wanted to beat this guy. So it's like, all right, I need to learn what that guy is learning. And he was motivated to learn Wing Chun to kick that dude's ass who just beat him. And so that means that he was clearly already having some fighting experience. So I think that Bruce Lee, according to even to Dan and Asanto, about like when they talk about Bruce Lee's fighting style, why Bruce Lee is known, especially on film, to kind of move more like Muhammad Ali, especially in Way of the Dragon, but that his actual boxing style was he was a lot more of a slugger in the pocket. When you see him, how he hit the bags and stuff. And I don't remember where I read it, but I believe in that fight with Gary Elms, I mean, he's just going in swinging for the fences. So I think that, some people say, oh, Bruce Lee was just a philosopher. He was just this, just that, or whatever. No, I think that Bruce Lee had an extremely high fight IQ. Clearly, for his 32 years, when you look at what he writes and what he was doing, to say that he has a high fight IQ, I think is a bit of an understatement. So I think that Bruce went in there with a tremendous amount of grit. He was a tough guy. He didn't give up easily. He had a big ego when he was a teenager. And I think that he beat Gary Elms, who was the champion, who had already won fights. I think he just beat him on pure grit. Because according to that Bloody Elbow article where they talked about that with Gary Elms and everything like that, Bruce didn't win by knockout.
Oh, the Requiem of the Fighter?
Yeah, Requiem of a Fighter.
Yeah.
And one of the things, Bruce Lee was very angry because he couldn't put that guy away because he wanted to put him away. And was annoyed with the boxing gloves. And I think that was part of the reason why he had certain issues. Like, he liked boxing, but he also had certain issues with it. And I think that had something to do with that Gary Elms fight. I believe the article says, because they have the Hong Kong article there, that he won on points very decisively. So I think that he won on volume. And where did he learn volume punches?
Wing Chun.
Wing Chun. Right. But of course, if we could go back in time and watch the fight, we might have a totally different idea about it. Right. We're just speculating on speculation. Right.
Yeah. Hey, let me ask you a difficult question.
Okay.
Is Bruce Lee the father of MMA?
Well, here's the problem with narratives. You can always create one. You can say you want to create a narrative, and it's very easy to cherry pick stories to support your narrative. So a strong argument can be made for that, because when you look at what Bruce Lee did, I don't think he foresaw it in a sportive context. I think he foresaw it in an evolution as a martial artist, that you have to be a complete martial artist. And in the landscape of the 60s and 70s, you look at like what the point fighting karate guys were so extremely robotic. When you look at what Bruce Lee was doing, he was like so far ahead of what they were doing.
Yeah.
Using kick shields and focus mitts in martial art. That was only boxers used focus mitts. Classical martial artists use that. And so an argument can be made when you read his notes. Because think about it, he was a traditionally trained Wing Chun guy who loved boxing, thought, would look at wrestling, would look at this, all these other kind of things. Most Chinese Kung Fu martial artists are so stuck in a bubble of not even of their own style, but even in the own lineage of their own style. Right. That for him to be doing that in the 50s and 60s is so tremendously incredible, right? So you could say, look, Bruce Lee was the first guy that was talking about being an integrated martial artist, to be complete in whatever that means, because even words like a complete fighter, complete martial, even that's a loaded term, right? But, whatever that means philosophically, we'll leave it at that. We'll let you decide what it means to be complete. Okay. And then to think about what modern MMA fighters have to do, and that they have to be competent at distance, in the pocket, in wrestling, on the ground. And that is definitely an expression of that narrative, right? And then you could say, yeah, but for the most part, outside of the people who follow the Jeet Kune Do concept, how many martial artists in the States were following that framework in '93 when the first UFC hit? Most martial artists in the States were still very traditional to their style. They gave Bruce Lee, props in his philosophy and lip service, but they weren't necessarily applying that in their own martial art. And the Gracies had a very powerful and effective martial art, and they had been doing that since the 50s in terms of, obviously they've been doing that before that, but in terms of the open fights, by the time Helio and Carlos had a name in Rio, it was like the 50s when they started to have those open fights, and then later with Kimura and Waldemar Santana and all of those guys. And so, and they were the ones that brought UFC, and they were the ones that brought, so you could say, maybe it's just Helio Gracie or Carlos. So it depends on your narrative, right? And so certain things, you have what's known as parallel thinking. And so, you can look at the old ancient Greek drawings of the Pancratian fighters, and you see that they hit with a vertical fist. And they did things that looked almost exactly like Wing Chun, weight on the back legs, simultaneous offense and defense. And you go, these guys came up with something very similar to Wing Chun in another part of it, because it's parallel thinking. Now, if you have 5 parallel streams, one of them might be the one that took off and made this a thing. And then the other parallel streams say, no, we were already there. And that would be correct if that's your narrative. But narratives are man-made. So you just have to be mindful, is this my personal narrative because I want it to be so? Or is this actually the way it is? Or are we now combining it together, right? And so I don't think that if MMA was developed completely independently of one shred of influence from Bruce Lee, that does not nullify one thing Bruce Lee did in his career at all. And so it needs to be understood. If other people came up with it and then developed it, does that nullify it if the Jeet Kune Do guys weren't the first guy to come up with UFC? No, not at all. So you can have a narrative that doesn't involve you glomming onto someone else's and still be just as correct and just as right. And so I always find narratives are a bit tricky.
Yeah, I sometimes I don't understand why it is that you hear Dana White say that, and it's like, well, no, he doesn't mean literally every aspect of MMA is due to Bruce Lee. You can just kind of get the gist of what the heck he's saying.
Yes. I think modern MMA people who normally don't have a lot of nice things to say about traditional martial artists, and when you hear someone like Joe Rogan attack traditional martial arts, I'm like, people are like, didn't you get mad Joe Rogan said something like this about Wing Chun? I'm like, oh no, he's totally right. I mean, like, people go, because they think you need to defend something like the people are so binary in the way they think. We can look now and look back at what Bruce Lee did and be like, hey, Bruce Lee was already on. Like, you look at certain things John Jones does in his fighting game, the lead leg side kick to the knee and the rear leg one, and this kind of pawing into the, and you look and you see exact same things in Bruce Lee's notes, right? And then you make that connection, even though maybe John Jones didn't get it from reading Bruce Lee's notes, but there's certain truths that ultimately are going to be found out by everyone. Now, of course, Dana White is going to say that because he's got a licensing deal with the Lee estate for the Bruce Lee UFC crossover stuff. So, I mean, you always have to be mindful there's marketing in there as well, right?
Well, exactly. It makes perfect sense for Dana White to align his organization with one of the most iconic martial artists of all time.
Yes.
Makes perfect sense.
100%.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. What was the other thing I wanted to be sure? Okay. We didn't talk about, I mean, we mentioned some names, but I didn't make you whittle it down to one choice. So you have to give me Kung Fu cinema, favorite actor, and favorite movie.
Sammo Hung, Prodigal Son. By far. One of the greatest pieces of Hong Kong Chinese martial arts cinema ever put together.
Hey, do you is that required viewing by your students?
No. You know, maybe 10 years ago, but in applying Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do philosophy, I no longer impose my burden on my students. Right? They can come and ask me what Kung Fu movies. We actually watch Kung Fu movies together all the time. So I'm joking.
Do you really?
Yeah. Prodigal Son is a very well written, very well produced, a very great film, which also happens to be about Wing Chun. But people say, "Oh, you like this as a Wing Chun movie?" No, I like it because it's a great piece of cinema. Yuen Biu and Sammo Hung are at the top of their game. And if the movie was about Hung Gar but was produced the same way, I would say the same thing. And Sammo Hung, for me, I love Sammo Hung. He's just the best.
Do people argue Warriors 2 versus Prodigal Son with you?
There is no comparison between the two. Warrior, and this is not my opinion. This is objective fact, right? I am telling you. Warriors 2 was Sammo Hung's first outing into using Wing Chun, because you have to realize that in Hong Kong cinema, all right, Vincent, take it off. Hey, don't talk about DC, only Marvel here. We got some instigators on the chat there. So, you know, the thing was that essentially between Golden Harvest and Shaw Brothers, for the most part, you had in Golden Harvest, because of Bruce Lee and then later Sammo Hung, you had more Wing Chun influence in the Golden Harvest films. And in Shaw Brothers films, you had, because of Lau Ka Leung, you had more of a Hong Kong influence, right?
Yeah.
So it's almost like you had the two competing houses were also the two biggest martial arts in Hong Kong. You had like kind of Wing Chun versus Hong Kong, right? And so Sammo thought that at some point there were just so many Hong Kong movies about Wong Fei Hung. He says, we have to find someone else to make a movie about, and then found out about Leung Chan, which is the Yip Man Sigong. He's the great patriarch of the Wing Chun style. And said, this guy was like Wong Fei Hung, let's make a movie about him, and made Warriors 2. But Sammo was still a little green in terms of knowing enough Wing Chun, because he had to borrow liberally and put a lot of high kicks and stuff like that. He got the formula right in Prodigal Son, in my opinion. So, yeah.
Okay. All right. So that's favorite film, favorite actor.
Sammo Hung for sure.
Oh, Sammo. Oh, really?
Sammo, yes. Sammo and Prodigal Son. Sammo in the Prodigal Son and Sammo in general. Watch Magnificent Butcher, Petty Cab Driver. There are so many films. Sammo is brilliant because he did everything Jackie Chan could do, but he did it in a big frame. And Sammo Hung has the other thing too, and I don't want to get too into it because I'll get in trouble. I know a number of Hong Kong actors. All right, like I've been blessed. Like you showed the photo of me with Lo Mong. I know, and I've had the, I don't know. I feel sometimes like I'm the Forrest Gump of Chinese martial arts. Somehow I always end up with a room like when I was at Angela Mao's restaurant with Jihan Jie, who fought Bruce Lee in Game of Death, and I'm sitting there, and she doesn't really speak English. And there was Jihan Jie, who's Korean, speaks English, and I was sitting, and they had not seen each other since the 70s. And I'm sitting there at a table at Angela Mao's restaurant, and there's Jihan Jie, who fought Bruce Lee in Game of Death, and there's Angela Mao, who is Bruce Lee's sister in Enter the Dragon, and I am translating Chinese between both of them. And there was a moment where, like, I kind of just started doing it. Like, he would say that, I would say something in Chinese, and then after a while, I all of a sudden realized what was going on, and I almost couldn't remember Chinese anymore because like, oh my God, who am I sitting with, right? And so I realized like, I feel like Forrest Gump. I end up here like I'm having lunch with the toad from Five Deadly Venoms. And so last year I was in Hong Kong and I met a stuntman who had been he was in Enter the Dragon. He was one of the yellow suits. Right? And Sean Madigan's, wait, you guys are still talking? He's going to get jealous. I'm going to have to deal with this afterwards. So I talked to him a little bit behind the scenes, and he had worked with Jackie, and he had worked with Sammo, and he had worked with Bruce Lee. And everyone who works with Sammo knows that he's a taskmaster, but they love him. But here's the funny thing, because Bruce Lee, for the most part, is known as a martial artist who made some really great movies and then unfortunately passed away prematurely. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to tell you something, and this is the honest truth. I heard this from many, many, many stuntmen in Hong Kong. Of all the people they worked with, the one that they all respect the most is Bruce Lee. Because Bruce Lee did something, and Sammo is also like, maybe Sammo is also, you also hear Sammo and Bruce Lee in terms of the respect of choreographers, they're the same. But I'm going to talk about Bruce Lee because not a lot of people talk about Bruce Lee, the movie guy, in this way. Bruce Lee had a very strong disdain for producers and directors. He hated Lo Wei. He had a contentious relationship with Raymond Chow, and he loved the stuntmen. And on the set of Enter the Dragon, everyone knows this, when they would call break and all the actors would go and eat with the crew, Bruce would eat with the stuntmen. And they would give him special food, and he would say, no, I'm going to eat the same as the stuntmen eat. And he would eat with the stuntmen, and in Chinese you say "atia zhao," which is chit-chat, BS a little bit. So he would be there with the stuntmen, and when they had problems, like getting paid or whatever, he would be the first one to say something. And so this actor who worked with Bruce Lee, he said, I've worked with them all, but the one who cared about the stuntmen the most was Bruce Lee. He was really there for us, and he would fight and argue with the directors if they didn't treat us fairly. He was really there for us, and he was a bigger star than Bruce Lee's to this day the biggest star. And of everyone they worked with, Bruce Lee was the one they respected the most, and they loved. Like, everyone knows the story about how Bruce accidentally hit Jackie with the stick or whatever. Yeah. Hear that story. What did Bruce Lee do immediately afterwards? Oh, sorry, and he gives Jackie Chan this big hug or whatever. You will not hear this from many other stunt people, having worked with other ones in Hong Kong as well. And this is why even Bolo Yeung, Bolo from Enter the Dragon, a very famous Chinese movie star who's not prone to exaggeration. His name is Chen Qimen, was on the set of Enter the Dragon and witnessed an arm wrestling contest between Bolo and Bruce Lee, in which Bruce Lee won. And Bolo, people think like, oh, Bolo was just some big tough guy who was in Enter the Dragon and maybe he was just there doing it. Bolo, and I know this from people who know Bolo, Bolo is the biggest Bruce Lee fan. And if anyone has a crossword to say about Bruce Lee, Bolo will get very, very angry. Yeah. And it's like, don't make Bolo angry. And it's interesting because certain people who really worked with Bruce Lee intimately, they have a lot of respect for Bruce Lee. Now, Bruce Lee was known as a hothead. He was known, but certain people who worked with him very intimately say some of the most beautiful things about him as a human being. And he's really, truly one of the most remarkable. And so that's why when I have the chance to sit and hear these stories from people who worked with him, I mean, I when I tell those stories, I get goosebumps about it because these are the things that we're in a time period now where the people who can tell you firsthand stories about working with Bruce Lee, they're getting older. And this is why every time I go to Hong Kong, I do my best to hear the stories, like just listen to them tell it, because same thing with students of Yip Man who are alive. I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, but we don't have that many years left. And so it's very important right now that we record this history, we learn the stories, we preserve it, because we're taking for granted certain people who've been around and who were there with people like Bruce Lee or Yip Man or any of these guys. It's 2020. Bruce Lee died in 1973. All right, this is a tremendous amount of time that's passed, and we cannot take for granted the few remaining sources that we do have, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that I did not think of it that way when I started doing this podcast, right? That part of what I'm actually doing is preserving legacy, let's say. I really didn't see that.
Yeah.
And but you're right. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if someone else doesn't do it, it's going to be a shame, because think about all the people who've already passed away. Think about, like, you know, like, can you imagine going back in time and being able to sit with James Yim Lee for 2 hours? Okay. And now, of course, you have to rely on stories from people who learn. And I'm just using him as an example, one of many. It could be anybody, right? But I use that example of him because he passed away before Bruce Lee. So his perspective would be very different, because James Yim Lee never lived in a post-Bruce Lee world.
Right.
So I'm sure, you know, because people often, it's called the hindsight bias. People tend to look and see what's happened and developed, and they tend to skew the narrative based on what happened afterwards. I want to know.
Oh, yeah, I see that all the time.
Yes.
All the time.
Yes. I'd be very interested just to go back in time and hear what Bruce Lee's students and people who knew him were saying about him in 1969, 1966, before he became this big star, and there was any kind of ego investment to kind of say certain things, you know? And so, but think about that. Besides maybe some of the people who learn with James Yim Lee, you're never going to hear it out of the horse's mouth. And what about people who train with Wing Chun with Bruce Lee in the 50s? Can you imagine just going back and just hearing someone who didn't even know Bruce Lee was going to be a superstar? Somebody who was just the guy next to him in the class. Because that guy's not going to say anything. He's like, yeah, that guy was there, but I still want to know what that guy said. Because you have to, when it comes to history, it's a tapestry of which you need to put together all of these things and then find out where are the common things that overlap, because that is the only way you're going to come to anything that remotely resembles the truth. Because we all have personal bias, even when we try not to. My perspective is limited to how I see things and interpret them, but it is never the totality of the truth, right? And so people need to be mindful of that bias in themselves when they tell stories and try to be, they try to hedge what they say with, well, this is how I see it, and take it for that and nothing else, right?
Yeah. So I'll tell you my bias. I just remember my bias when it comes to favorite kung fu film: Snake and Crane Arts of Shaolin.
That's an old Lo Wei film, I believe. That's an early Taiwanese film of Jackie Chan before he became a big star. So remember, I said very early on, hours and hours ago when we started, there was this, in rock and roll, there was a time before the Beatles and the time after the Beatles. In Kung Fu movies, there was a time before Bruce Lee and after Bruce Lee. In Jackie Chan's career, there was the time before Snake in the Eagle's shadow and after.
Yes. Hey, do you know what the I call it the Hong Kong title, right? Because Snake in the Eagle's shadow is the American title. Do you know what we saw that as in Barbados?
What was it?
It was snake fist, eagle claw, cat's paw.
Oh, you know, because that's the Chinese title.
Yeah, that's what we saw.
That's the original Chinese title, which is not sexy in English at all, right?
Right.
That was actually Jackie Chan's real first bona fide hit, because it was really the first time he was able to embrace the fact that he was not Bruce Lee, that the only way for him to be great was to do kung fu comedy. And that was, and he was on loan from Raymond Chow to Si Yun to do those two movies. And then he did Drunken Master, and then the rest is history. So I don't really watch too many of of Jackie Chan's films before Snake and the Eagle Shadow. I know he did a couple. Fearless Hyena is okay. Half a loaf of kung fu is half a loaf of dog nonsense. I can't watch any of those movies, right? Anything after that, I'll watch because I am a snob and I'll admit it.
Yeah. Before Bruce Lee, my favorites were Chen Quan Tai
Mhm.
and Chi Quan Chun.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those were my boys.
Those very and Chen Guan, it's Chinese. Chen Guan Tai. Chen Guan Tai was also a professional fighter, and so in addition to him having traditional kung fu chops, he was also like a full contact champion. He was like a legit fighter as well. And there are photos of Chen Guan Tai and Bruce Lee together when Bruce Lee went to
Yes.
Shaw Brothers, because he did that to annoy Raymond Chow. He brought a bunch of reporters and was hanging out at Shaw Brothers to kind of remind him, like, you better respect me, otherwise I'm going somewhere else. Right? Bruce was very good at the art of war in that way.
I'm gonna mess up the pronunciation because I cannot do the Chinese pronunciation, but I'm gonna try to raise my stock in your eyes.
Okay.
Chen Quan Tai's style,
yes,
was Tai Xin Pei Gua.
Tai Xing Pei Gua.
Ah.
Tai Xing is essentially monkey kung fu, but it's not really monkey kung fu. It's actually two. Tai Xing. Tai Xing is the great sage. That's the monkey. Pei Gua is the axe fist, which is very similar to Choi Lei Fut. So Tai Xing Pei Gua is a fusion of a kind of a northern axe fist, or let's just say axe fist. Let's not say northern. These are loaded terms. And monkey kung fu. And the former patriarch of that style, Chan Shaochong, recently just passed away. He taught that style, but also he was very smart because he sent a bunch of his guys to go fight in contests, and he had them learn essentially a very strong style of kickboxing. So when they went in the ring, they weren't necessarily using Tai Xing Pei Gua. They were doing like pretty solid kickboxing. And so he had a number of very skillful students, and Chen Guan Tai was one of them. Yeah. Okay.
Favorite Lau Kar Lung movie?
I love Lau Ka Leung. Lau Ka Leung is I love Lau Ka Leung to death. I would say it's probably 8 Diagram Pole Fighter because it was his most emotional film, and it's the most uncharacteristic. Well, actually, it's a tie between that and Heroes of the East. Heroes of the East is where he marries the Japanese woman, right? And the whole movie, the whole plot is a very cheap excuse to get this Chinese style versus this Japanese style. And it is the equivalent of a Chinese martial arts porn from beginning to end, right? Where the story is just a very cheap thread to connect the fight scenes. The reason why I love that movie is because that was the first Kung Fu movie I saw outside of Bruce Lee's movies. If Bruce Lee's films made me fall in love with Bruce Lee, Heroes of the East made me fall in love with Kung Fu. And Gordon Lau, and it's also one of many Lau Kar Leung films where no one dies in the movie, which is uncharacteristic of many Shaw Brothers films in which they have so much death, right? And Lau Kar Leung had a number of movies in which no one died, and that movie was about martial arts, and I learned a lot about martial arts in there. And the Japanese, the head villain Yasuaki Karata, who does the ninja at the end,
we should tell the Americans, in our audience, because they might go looking for Heroes of the East. It's called Challenge of the Ninja.
Yeah, right? It was in the 80s. If you get it now, it's been updated to Heroes of the East.
Heroes of the East. Good.
So I met Yasuaki Karata in Hong Kong, which was like so mind-blowing for me because it was also the first time I had ever heard someone speak Cantonese with a Japanese accent, and it was like mind-blowing. And he taught a seminar. He has a school in Hong Kong. He splits his time, from what I understood, between Tokyo and Hong Kong, and he has a school in Hong Kong. And I went there to do a seminar, not because I necessarily wanted to learn that. I wanted to meet Yasuaki Karata, and so I went there, and I did the seminar, and he was amazing. And he taught in English, and then he would occasionally speak Cantonese with this like Japanese accent. It was so amazing. And then I went up to him, and because that movie, he was one of the first action stars I saw as a child. And I gave him a banner for my school to hang in his school, which is a traditional Chinese custom. When you visit another Sifu, you give them the banner for your school, they give them the banner for yours, and you hang them up in your respective schools. So I gave him my banner, and I told him, I said, you know, when I saw Heroes of the East as a child, I go, this made me love Chinese martial arts. It made me love Chinese Kung Fu. And I go, and you were in that film, and it was such a huge part of my upbringing. And I just want to thank you. And he looked at me, and he was like, oh, like, I don't know. Oh, that makes me so happy. And he was so, because, you know, sometimes you want to gush to someone, and you gush, and they're like, yeah, thanks, kid. And they walk away, right? Yeah. And he was like, oh, thank you so much. And then I gave him my banner, and he didn't just put it aside. He looked at it, and then he asked me about it. And it was very similar to meeting Sammo Hung. It was like, and Yas, a beautiful human being. Absolutely love him to death. So that was one of my favorite movies. But 8 Diagram Pole Fighter, because Alexander Fusheng passed away during the filming of that movie. And Alexander Fusheng, I'm a huge, not only because he's my namesake, but I'm a bit obsessed with Alexander Fusheng because he moved into Bruce Lee's old home, and almost 10 years to the day died in a car accident. And which is one of the reasons why they thought that house was cursed. Although neither Bruce Lee nor Alexander Fusheng actually died in that house, but they died while living there. So that's why it had to get it. But 8 Diagram Pole Fighter, Alexander Fusheng died halfway through the making of that film, and they had to completely rewrite it. And everyone, including Lau Kar-leung, they were heartbroken because everyone loved Alexander Fusheng because he was one of the sweetest human beings. I've met a number of actors who worked with him, and they all like gush about how great Alexander Fusheng was and how much you never hear a salty Alexander Fusheng story. Everyone loved Alexander Fusheng. And when he died, Lau Kar-leung was broken. Like, he stopped making that movie and like couldn't do anything for a while. He rewrote the film, and he eventually came back. And he had to rewrite it to make Lau Ka-fai, Gordon Liu, the main actor, because he was initially, Alexander Fusheng was supposed to be the main guy in that movie, and then they had to change it to make it Lau Ka-fai's character. When you watch the last fight scene in that movie, it is so uncharacteristically angry and violent. Like Lau Kar-leung, even if he had bloody movies, there was always some justification. 36 chambers. You're fighting for the people because the Manchus are oppressing the people. There's something, even to this day, with everything that's going on in our country, you can look at 36 chambers and understand the Chinese people being the people and the Qing being the oppressors and wanting to fight against them. And it still speaks to us to this day. The end of 8 Diagram Pole Fighter does not have that philosophy. It is angry because Lau Kar-leung was channeling his anger of the death of Alexander Fusheng. And when you know that, you watch that movie, again, I hate to sound repetitive, with goosebumps, because it was Lau Kar-leung's catharsis to get over his grief of Alexander Fusheng. And the way the film changes in the second act, and at the very end, the final scene in 8 Diagram Pole Fighter, you see all the brothers, and the last is Fusheng. And you see that was like the only way Lau Kar-leung could get over his grief for the loss of someone that everyone loved. And that was this film. And when you understand that, you realize that, you know, Heroes of the East is my favorite because it's a beautiful movie. 36 Chambers is if I say 36 Chambers is a great movie, my favorite, everyone's like, oh, you don't know anything. That's what everyone says, right? But 8 Diagram Pole Fighter, that's Lau Kar-leung literally bearing his soul to the world in a way he never did before and never did after. So that's why that holds a very special meaning for me.
So, and as if I didn't have enough reasons to envy you before we started talking, when I was doing my research on you, I saw a response or a comment on your Facebook from James Liu.
Oh, yes. Big
I
Trouble
mean,
in Little China.
one of my childhood heroes, man.
I tell you, I am the Forrest Gump of the Kung Fu world, right? Why I know any of these people is beyond me. James Liu, of course, Big Trouble in Little China. He was in Rush Hour, and it's just like, in the 80s, he was one of the most prominent Chinese stunt. You saw him and James Hong in everything, right?
Everything.
And
yes.
so a number of years ago, they were shooting Luke Cage in New York, the second season. And James Liu was the fight coordinator. And he wanted to teach stunt fighting, and he needed a place. And I had a bunch of students who were actors, and by way of the universe conspiring,
right.
he used City Wing Chun to teach a stunt class every Sunday.
Wow.
And then so I met him, and it's yeah, I mean, you understand when you're in martial arts, so certain heroes, you meet them, and it's maybe some people go, he's a stunt guy, he was never the main guy, whatever. It's dude, he's a Big Trouble in Little China. Yeah. And for me, and I meet him, and I was like, hey, Mr. like a teenage schoolgirl, right? And and then he'll he still sometimes he'll retweet something or he'll comment on my Facebook. And I would be totally lying if I don't squeak a little bit when I see that notification, still. And same, sometimes I just feel very blessed in that way, and so of course sometimes you meet your heroes and you're very disappointed, and other times it's the other way. I've been very lucky. I think the only guy who ever upset me was Van Damme, but other than that, everybody has been super, super cool. So,
Yeah. Hey, have you ever met Inosanto?
I did. So I met Sifu Inosanto because Dr. Mark Cheng, who's a good friend of mine, and obviously a student of Sifu Inosanto, and truly a Renaissance man. And Dr. Mark Cheng, I can't say enough great things about him. I mean, I sometimes I wish they were two me's, and one me would just literally just hang out with Doc and just pick his brain constantly, because he's just such an amazing source of martial arts. So he actually brought me, I believe I met Sifu Inosanto once, and then I think I watched a Kali class or something like that over there too. So I had the chance to meet him. And again, I'm just same kind of thing. Right? Yeah, I'm very lucky. I mean, I wish I had more chance to meet him. And I know that the JKD world is very divisive, but I'm the Wing Chun guy. I sit on the fence and watch this stuff with the popcorn. For me, I want to meet all these guys. The thing I always remark about Dan Inosanto, about Sifu Inosanto is this. I think people don't, because there's definitely people who attack him for certain ways that he do. Some people, everything he does, they love it. And some people don't like certain things. And I go, look, what an unenviable position to be in after the death of someone like Bruce Lee. And you can disagree with how he does certain things. He definitely, one thing you can respect about him is he did his own thing and stands on his own merits as a man and a martial artist. And very few people are willing to do that because so many people find comfort in staying with the status quo and what they learned before. And if there's any true definition of a leader and someone who stood for himself, it's Sifu Inosanto. Because he could have very easily stopped and just taught what Bruce Lee taught him for years and years and years, and he'd probably be attacked for just doing that if he had just taught that or whatever. But can you imagine? You learn martial arts from this amazing Chinese Sifu because he shut you down. He convinced you. You're following him. You think it's really great. You have no idea. People forget. The way we look at this guy now is not the way people looked at him in 1967. He was a Sifu. He was great. He was awesome. But he wasn't. Bruce Lee is a legend now, like Elvis, like James Dean. He's not a famous martial arts guy. He is a legend. He's one of the top earning dead celebrities, one of always in the top 10, top 15 every year. He has a legend status. And you learn from this guy not knowing that is what's going to happen when he unfortunately passes away very mysteriously at a young age. What an unenviable position for any man to be in. Right. And it's so easy to put someone down and say, oh, he did this wrong or he did this wrong. I defy anybody to be in his shoes to be essentially one of the successors. Maybe that's not the right word. Let's just say one of the one of the style bearers of Jeet Kune Do, however you want to pack it. I don't want to get into the terminology and stuff like that. After that man dies, what a tremendous burden, man. Holy crap. And any lesser man would not have been able to handle that amount of stress. And so I have nothing but respect for Sifu Inosanto for doing that, because I'm lucky in the longtime lineage, in under my teacher longtime. I'm one of many. I even left his association, so I'm doing my own thing, although I teach his system. If something were to happen to him, okay, I would never know the burden of stress that Sifu Inosanto knew, and I'm thankful for that, because I don't know how many people can actually do such a great job as what that man did. Whether you agree with him or not, that man stood on his own. And when you're a student of someone legendary like that, that is more than most people can do. So I have nothing but respect for Sifu Inosanto.
Two times in my life, right? This is why he's one of my heroes. 2 times in my life, I was accorded unexpected respect because I'm his student. Once was by the Moyet Wing Chun people.
Yes.
Because he is part of their lineage.
Right. Moyet had taught Dan Inosanto for a bit. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The second time was by Chuck Norris.
Wow. So cool. That's great.
When Chuck Norris heard that I was an Inosanto student, he relaxed, and he and I had like a hour-long conversation.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. So,
incredible. Yeah, I mean, I really hope when things come back to the new normal, whatever that is, I really one thing about being in this kind of quarantine time is I really appreciate the fact that I've had the chance to meet so many great people. But even in this situation, had it not been for this situation here, maybe we wouldn't have done this. And I'm super grateful for you to have me on, because it is great to talk to you. Fantastic.
I appreciate the heck out of it, man.
And so we adapt to it or whatever. But the moment we have a chance to kind of meet with people and all that kind of stuff, I really want to make my way out to California again and see if I can just have another hour with Sifu Inosanto, and just because I just feel it's nothing like the students who train with him day in and day out. But sometimes you just get a little piece sometimes from someone, and sometimes that's all you need, and that's all that enriches you enough. And so I really appreciate the time that I have to spend with people now a lot more, and hope that other people also realize the value of really important relationships, and also to value people that you have something to learn from, and that you can respect, and not to take people for granted, because even if they're around, sometimes you cannot even see them. Like, look at the current situation right now,
Yeah, for sure. All right. Okay. Listen, enough is enough. Right?
Everyone is like, in the comments,
a bunch of people, right? A bunch of people have come back and said, "You guys are still talking."
Funny.
All right. Listen, thanks so much for doing this, man. I appreciate it.
Anytime, brother. Anytime.
All right. Okay. And my apologies to that other guy for taking up your time. Tell him.
I'm going to totally hear it next time. He's going to be like, you want to do the podcast on the weekend just so that you can do that podcast, the Jeet Kune Do dialogues, and he gets a little ex-girlfriend psycho-y from time to time,
No. All right. Okay. All right. Listen, thanks so much, man. I appreciate it.
Anytime.
All right.
Take care.
Okay. Have a good one. Take care.
Bye-bye. Well, the history of Wing Chun is a highly debated topic. There's a number of different viewpoints in terms of where the style originated and so on. And basically you have these kind of arguments in all styles, whether you're talking about traditional Japanese styles or other Chinese martial arts styles. There always seems to be a little bit of debate or controversy about the origins. And unfortunately, what a lot of people forget is, regardless of how things started or how the martial arts started exactly, it's here and we have it, and it's a treasure of China, especially a martial art like Wing Chun, and it's our duty basically to preserve it and keep it for future generations. And of course, what we need to do, and what one of our duties as martial artists to do, is to improve it for the future generations. So whether one believes in one viewpoint or the other viewpoint, at the end of the day, doesn't really matter. You can leave the research to the historians and the researchers, and everybody else can just practice it. The most commonly accepted legend of Wing Chun is basically that it came from a nun named Moi, who taught a girl named Yim Wing Chun basically to fight off a bandit. Now, there's actually no real historical proof, or there are no real hard facts to suggest that the story actually occurred. In fact, there are a number of gaps in the story itself that don't really make a lot of sense. For example, the name of the Buddhist nun is Moi, which is actually not the type of name that a Buddhist nun, especially one at that time, would have adopted for themselves. Moi actually, depending on how you translate it in Chinese, can mean 5 dots, which is actually the foundation of the basic footwork in Wing Chun. So it's possible that that name is just some kind of code for somebody who knew some type of footwork or some type of basic idea in Kung Fu that started what Wing Chun was about. But whether there's an actually person who is named Moi is probably not the case. However, what a lot of people forget about stories is sometimes, even if the story is not historically accurate or didn't actually happen, the lesson that can be gained from the story is still very powerful. One, because Wing Chun, according to legend, was taught to a woman and was used by a woman to fight off basically a bandit, a larger man who had some martial arts training. The story tells us something very important. That means that Wing Chun is supposed to work for smaller people to fight against somebody who's bigger and stronger than them. And that lesson is actually more important than whether the real story with Moi and Yim Wing Chun actually happened. According to most research, Wing Chun probably came from the southern Shaolin temple. Whether it was actually developed there or whether it was just harboring martial artists who actually developed the styles there, that's also a bit debatable. You can do your own research on that, and everybody comes up with their own conclusion in terms of how things developed. One of the things that we do know for sure is that the forms that we practice nowadays, Sunam Tao, Chamkyu, Byuji, and even the wooden dummy, actually were developed a little bit later. They came from the original Wing Chun style even before it was called Wing Chun, but the formalized sets that we practice nowadays are actually much newer than people would like to believe. And there are even some people who theorize that Great Grandmaster Yip Man's Pat Cham Do technique, the double knife technique, was actually created by Great Grandmaster Yip Man himself. Of course, when people say stuff like that, it makes them very upset. I'm only the messenger. This is what people are talking about nowadays. And whether it came from Grandmaster Yip Man or it came from another generation, it doesn't really matter. We have it in our hands now. And again, it's our duty to preserve these things for the future.